Bonjour, je suis Alejandro Bonilla Garcia.
Hello, my name is Alexandra Bonilla Garcia. I'm the president of the Greycells Association. I would like to welcome you to this intergenerational dialogue for 2021 on humanity, people, planet, and prosperity. Thank you to those of you who've joined us here in Geneva. Thank you to those of you who are joining us throughout the 5 continents of the world. Greycells organizes international dialogues each year, but this year it's special because we haven't had any live activities for 18 months now, and it's a real pleasure to see the people, colleagues and friends here in person. Of course, we've had to respect social distancing, and it's necessary to do so, but we've really been missing this social contact. Greycells
Powerful tools for development is dialogue. And when you engage into dialogue, in particular if you engage into intergenerational dialogue, you bring the opportunity to interact, to connect beyond your own beliefs, beyond your own age group, and beyond generations. This gives an opportunity to welcome other groups of thinking. And intergenerational dialogue brings connection. Connection brings trust, and trust brings engagement. And at the end, when we're talking about sustainable development goals, aren't we talking about engagement between the different generations? At Greycells, we believe that is the case. In the panels that we're going to have today, we're having precisely that. Engage women and men of all ages that are acting for development at the local level, at the national level, and at the global level. They will show us the diversity and the complexity of working in developmental issues. And hopefully they will show us, I'm sure they will, that development is at our reach, that we can reach development, that it is at our reach, but we have to earn it. We cannot take it for granted. We have to work, we have to write, we have to act, we have to plan, and actually even we have to manifest or even fight for it. It's really important that the thinking becomes action and that the action becomes impact. And since the center of our attention in this intergenerational dialogue are the Sustainable Development Goals, I cannot think of anybody better to set the stage than Madame Tatiana Valovaya, the Director General of the United Nations Office in Geneva. She has been kind enough to send us a short message that I will share with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, it is my great pleasure to address this intergenerational dialogue. I thank Greycells and its many partners for organizing this event and for bringing together different generations, both young people as well as current and former international civil servants, united by their search for solutions to challenges of our time. Can social mobilization shape the agenda at local, national, and global levels? For me, the question is not if it can, because it already does. But the question is how this is done and what more to do to strengthen participation and inclusion. In January 2020, 1 month before the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic across the world, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres identified 4 global threats that endanger our common future: metaphorically naming them the four horsemen. First, the highest global geostrategical tension in years. Second, an existential climate crisis. Third, deep and growing global mistrust. And fourth, the dark side of modern technological progress. In addition, inequalities are the source of many global challenges. It is also important to strengthen inclusion and create conditions for equal participation of everyone, men and women alike, in all our activities and decision-making process. To face current global challenges, we need more inclusive and effective multilateralism with vision, ambition, and impact. The 21st century multilateralism must be networked, drawing on the experience and expertise of different international and regional organizations, civil society, cities, businessmen, local authorities, young people, and academia. Bringing different voices and perspectives to the discussions and decision-making table helps taking informed decisions, creating lasting partnerships, and developing innovative solutions. At the United Nations office at Geneva, we value opportunities to engage with young people in the context of Young Activist Summit, Model United Nations, sessions of young reporters at the UN. These events allow young people to be heard at multilateral fora and participate in development of solutions that affect their future. Ladies and gentlemen, in order to create a true and lasting paradigm shift, we must change our mindset. The COVID-19 pandemic offers essential lessons and avenues for us to advance. It forces the international community to adjust its strategies and tools to deliver jointly on sustainable development, provide support to the most vulnerable, and ensure inclusion for all. We can see how civil society is gaining strength. Emerging young leaders and civil society organizations are strongly committed to making solidarity, inclusion, and sustainability a reality. Today's event provides an excellent opportunity to hear examples of how social mobilization can influence global and local agenda. It also offers an opportunity to strengthen intergenerational partnerships in order to advance our joint action towards sustainable development. I wish you forward-looking and fruitful discussions. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more. I don't know if you're with me, but I think that the words that Mrs. Tatiana Valeva just mentioned are the key words, is vision, ambition, and impact. La collaboration entre...
And the collaboration between international organizations, the multilateral system, and the City of Geneva has existed for over 100 years. And I am certain that at the time, no one would have thought that in Geneva there would be a permanent representation of 181 countries. There would be over 100 international organizations and almost 650 NGOs, all working for peace and development. As our honorary president Michael Muller has said, Geneva is the smallest of large cities and certainly the city that has the greatest influence towards peace and development. And we are lucky enough and we have the honor of having with us Mrs. Christina Kitsos, administrative advisor for the City of Geneva, in charge of the Department for Social Cohesion and Solidarity, which represents within this international dialogue this ecosystem, this unique and ecosystem that cannot be reproduced elsewhere, this international City of Geneva, a place of peace and development. Mrs. Kitsos, you have the floor. Welcome to each of you, despite the fact that the pandemic has been here for over a year. As you can see, I'm unable to put my mask on as I should. Madame the Director of the United Nations Office, I'd like to salute them despite being at a distance. Mr. President of Greycells, ladies and gentlemen, panelists, ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of Greycells, ladies and gentlemen, representative of associations of youth and seniors, ladies and gentlemen, in Geneva and elsewhere in the world, I am truly honored to be amongst you. I am delighted to be amongst you for this second edition of the Intergenerational Dialogues organized by Greycells. As you've said in the past, it is true that in the City of Geneva, we often speak of socially mixing people. How can we work on the creation of links, not only intergenerational links, but more generally, how can we make sure to create links to make sure that people are ready for encounter? It is true that very often when we speak of encounters, we feel as if it were something rather basic, but it is not so, because in the urban context, such as the one we live in the contemporary society, such as the one we live in, we often have such difficulties despite the overabundance of communication means. It is sometimes hard for us to meet. And I find it even more important to have true links between international Geneva and the more local Geneva, as well as with issues which are migratory questions, social matters, which affect a different kind of public. How can we create such links between people who amongst themselves create the wealth of international Geneva? When I think of this, I'm thinking of specific elements. For instance, the question of undocumented migrants, which is the prosperity of Geneva. And the people are not visible, they don't have access to rights. And we've seen with the pandemic that we've seen from one day to the next, people lose their employment. And we saw how it resulted the image of Geneva in the world, one of the most prosperous cities. And yet, in terms of the policies that we've had to implement, policies which we would call palliative, I think you all have in mind the distribution of food services where people were expecting food packages. These distributions are still going on today, despite the situation being stabilized. So we can see everything that is at stake here, and the importance when we speak of social policies, when we speak to see how we can always put at the heart of our actions people's rights. I think this is where we can truly rethink our relations, our social and economical relations. And this is where people find a true place within society. So this pandemic has also shown the tensions. I'm not sure whether it is the right term, intergenerational tensions, but on the other hand, there was also the opportunity that can be found in every crisis, the very positive opportunity. We can find beauty in all sorts of projects. Most issues, we can reveal or highlight a number of behaviors that have been truly positive. We've seen the commitment of senior associations of youth. Many projects have been set in place during this time. They see that there was a true wave of solidarity, which we had not imagined before the pandemic started. But we've also experienced, we've also lived quite differently throughout this time, depending on our age, our situation. We are not all equal. And we've seen this particularly with youth or smaller children who live in tinier housing situations. We've seen domestic violence or children who couldn't eat as much as they should have had, and who haven't lived the confinement as well as they should have. And then we saw that for the elderly, also what was highlighted by a number of sociology studies from the University of Geneva or by Cynthia Fleury, the psychoanalyst and psychologist refugees whom we recently invited in the city of Geneva, we see that there are these tensions between the intensity and the longevity of life. And with this is another thing that we question ourselves on, because people who were over 65, people would have said, well, I was in great shape for a year, 2 years, for all these years, and somehow I'm not being allowed to live the intensity that I feel. So we had to turn towards a new way of looking at life based on biology. And we've had also feedbacks from many people who said that we feel infantilized, we feel as we were treated as children. We are only described basis on being seniors. What does senior mean? Senior means that it is the people who are over 65. And of course, I don't think this people's identity shouldn't be reduced to their age. But there was a true questioning around that. And I think that one of the things that is at stake for us right now is the post-COVID era, because despite the fact that on the sanitary front, as I hope, the situation should calm down, in terms of the social consequences, human consequences, or the more psychological consequences, well, the impact still needs to be taken into account, and lessons still need to be drawn. This is what I wanted to say in a few words, and if you'll allow me, I will also conclude by quoting Cynthia Fleury, who truly inspires me, since she says in one of her works, she speaks courage at the center of our action as a virtue, not just for individuals as such, individuals who must have creativity and courage, but also for institutions. And I find that terribly interesting, because we're often have defiance towards institutions. And the question is, how can institutions question themselves? Well, there isn't a better moment to question oneself than a crisis period, to question our policies and to see whether we were guided by impotence or whether we could have done better. But in order to do so, this value of courage truly has to guide us. And therefore, I quote Cynthia Fleury, who says the courage is a key element in periods of insecurity because they create degraded systems where the effacement of morals can take place, and prioritization, economy of survival, the biology of life, as well as the banalization of the state of exception and emergency, can all create a bitter world, more threatening, more where the liberties are deprived, and where justice is often harmed. This requires courage and care. And I think that in Geneva, with these types of dialogues, such as the one we're having tonight, well, this allows us to have a different perspective, to think and to carry within each of us on a daily basis these values of courage and care. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mrs. Kitsos, for this word. We all agree with you. And it is not only about counting the years of life. We have to give life to the years. And when we commit into an intergenerational dialogue, we can eliminate all labels and to see that we are all humans. We are all people with needs. There isn't an expiry date. We have the same friends, the same needs at any age. Thank you for your message. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank the City of Geneva, to thank the Foundation for Geneva for their contribution and their sponsoring of this activity, which allows us to have this hybrid form, and which is essential to give access to our event in 5 continents. Thank you for your generosity. Hello, Mr. Sedou. Good evening. Of course, in Geneva, there is no need to introduce you. Everyone knows you in Geneva. But since people are watching us all over the world, I'd like to say that one of you are the key presenters, journalists in Geneva. And it is the second time that you lead our intergenerational dialogue. Thank you so much for being here with us. I now give you the floor so that you may guide us through this international dialogue.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and hello to all of you. I'm delighted to be here tonight. Quite a dense program. We're going to start with a first discussion devoted to the planet. And I'd like for the panelists to come and join me now. Those of you who are here and those of you who are joining remotely can get ready. But firstly, a message. We're going to listen to a message now from Madame Gro Harlem Brundtland, who is the Prime Minister of Norway and Director General of the World Health Organization. She's speaking tonight for the Elders Association, founded, as you might know, by Nelson Mandela, which brings together former heads of state and public officers at a very high level for development and peace in the world. And we're going to listen to her message right now with your green button.
Dear friends, it is indeed an honor and a privilege to address you today on the occasion of your intergenerational dialogue on people, planet, and prosperity. I'm only sorry that we cannot all be together in Geneva, a city that has a special place in my affections from many years working there as Director General of the WHO. And so often together with my dearly missed friend Kofi Annan. Kofi was always a firm believer in intergenerational dialogue, and I'm sure he would have seen it as an essential element to charting our collective path out of the current crisis posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. For the last 5 years of his life, Kofi and I worked closely together as chair and deputy chair of the Elders, the group of independent former leaders founded by Nelson Mandela with a mandate to support peace, justice, and human rights worldwide. In the course of our work, we would often meet young leaders, young activists, whether at UN climate summits, community events in South Africa, or university debates. Now, whatever the occasion, Kofi would always tell the young people with great seriousness, but also a smile in his eyes, you are never too young to lead and never too old to learn. That message of inspiration and humility is particularly relevant to the current global situation. It amplifies the wider point about the importance of social mobilization to shape the civic and policy agenda. COVID-19 has brutally exposed failures of leadership at all levels in society and exacerbated existing inequalities. But at the same time, we have seen tremendous examples of social mobilization at a community level, between neighbors, colleagues, and generations, providing mutual support during a public health emergency and an unprecedented slump. The challenge we face now is to build on this social mobilization and resilience whilst maintaining pressure on political leaders to take responsibility and proactive steps to avert future pandemics and other crises. We must learn the lessons from the successes and failures of the pandemic to ensure that global citizens and policymakers alike are better prepared for future challenges, including the climate crisis, the gender gap, and economic inequalities. This must include developing inclusive, transparent, and responsive institutions and processes that can acknowledge grassroots perspectives and propose solutions that are credible to all stakeholders. Such an approach has been key to my work in public life since I first entered government in Norway as environment minister in the 1970s. I became deeply involved, engaged, and convinced in pursuing a pattern of development that could benefit everyone, protect our planet, and promote peace. I continued this agenda as Prime Minister in the 1980s, while I also chaired the World Commission on Environment and Development at the invitation of UN Secretary General Javier Pérez de Cuellar. Our 1987 report, Our Common Future, became a landmark document that brought global warming and sustainable development to the attention of presidents, prime ministers, and finance ministers. While preparing our report, my fellow commissioners and I traveled widely to get a truly global perspective. These consultations took us to countries including Brazil and Indonesia, which at that time were still governed by military dictatorships. However, I insisted that civil society voices should be able to participate in our sessions, including trade unionists, women's groups, youth, and church leaders. Our report was richer for their contributions, and in our humble way, we helped bolster their position with their societies against state oppression and intimidation. Nearly 4 decades later, the world has changed immeasurably. But the principles of dialogue, solidarity, and an engaged citizenry remain indispensable to finding common solutions to our shared challenges. Today, I stand with my fellow elders in urging world leaders and decision makers to give primary consideration to the interconnectivity of the problems we face, and to give civil society, not least young people, a meaningful voice in articulating and delivering the solutions to our shared challenges. The pandemic has highlighted our mutual dependency. We are all in this together. Only through social mobilization, intergenerational dialogue, and upholding the values of multilateralism, illustrated by the life and the enduring example of Kofi Annan, can we hope to overcome today's crisis and leave a better world for our children and grandchildren. Thank you so much.
So there's our first message. We're going to start our first panel now. Not on the planet, that'll be the second one, but on social inequalities. I'm delighted to have a lot of personalities here who are very committed on an international level in different countries, united in their fight, in their common ideology, and we'll see that they are in very different situations and they have their own way in their own regions to move forward and work towards and against social inequalities. So from India, we have Anina Malag. Good afternoon. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you. La bienvenue. Vous êtes directrice.
Welcome. You're the director for the Centre of Equity and Inclusion. We also have with us today in the room Adama Sane from Italy. Good afternoon. You can take a microphone.
Vous êtes cofondateur, président directeur.
You are the co-founder and CEO of Moleskine Foundation, Education and Creativity for Social Change, and also involved in the Wiki Africa Education Initiative. Thank you for being here. Olive Linui Kinya, good afternoon. You've taken a master's in Geneva in advanced studies, and you're the founder of an NGO on child and family poverty. And you work in Cameroon, but wherever you go as well, because for you, solidarity doesn't have borders. It could be here or elsewhere in the States where you commit to your work, and you're going to talk us about that later. Abida Kazim, good evening. You are a journalist, a Yazidi survivor from northern Iraq, a witness of the genocide committed by ISIS. You were one of the first to document this genocide. You made this visible on an international scale. It's a considerable amount of work to be done, very brave. We have with us here a journalist and a colleague who's done this work, and we feel very small alongside you, so thank you very much for sharing your story with us. Thank you very much, but I'd just like to point out this genocide is not over yet. It continues. Of course, we'll talk about this as well, but you were the first to make this visible to everybody, and that's something that we need to highlight here. Thank you very much and well done. And I'd like to greet as well Gabrielle Cola. You're a senior research associate at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development and a member of Greycells organizing this evening. And at the end of the panel, you'll be taking the floor to conclude what's been said during the panel and conclude. And there will be questions from the room or from Zoom for anybody who would like to at the end. We'll leave 5 to 10 minutes at the end of each debate for that. So either within the room or remotely. Adima Kazim, I'm going to start with you. Could you tell us about your childhood in Iraq and the events which led to this genocide and this drama?
Je vais parler en anglais. Je parle français, mais je préfère m'exprimer.
I will speak in English. I do speak French, but I'd rather speak in English.
Childhood in Iraq, actually, unfortunately, I have been born and grown up in the war. So all I've seen was war, poverty, rejection, and in a little bubble, I would say. I've been grown up in a little bubble. No right, no education. I've never been to school when I was a child because I was not recognized because of the war. I've done self-education 18 years home until 2014. But we were still with our community, we were still home, thinking that we have peace because we were together, even though we were like a small minority in a little part, rejected, nobody was hearing us. Until 2014, when actually the biggest thing that have happened, which was a genocide. The genocide that the Islamic State committed against my community, the Yazidi. I am one of the last people who left the village before the Islamic State arrived. I've lost 70 members of my family who are still kidnapped. Some of them we found their bodies. Some of them we know that they've been taken and we will never see them again. Some became child soldiers and they have been taken. We will never see them again. And then I was one of those people who survived and who decided to take the responsibility to document and to tell the world what have happened with us. And unfortunately, the international communities, they failed to protect us. They failed to do something for us. But we continue to tell our stories. We continue to advocate about the genocide. So we would be like one of the last communities, one of the last minority who face a genocide. We want to make sure that no other people, no other generations, or no other minorities go through what we have been through.
J'ai une question très naïve, mais au fond, pourquoi?
I have a very naive question. Why? Why are people coming after you?
The history of an ethnic religious minority, the Yazidi, one of the very old religion in Iraq, in Turkey, in Iran, and in Syria, in the Middle East. So now, today we are everywhere. We have a big community in Armenia, in Germany. We migrated from the Middle East. we have this history of genocide. You know, the genocide that I faced was the 74th genocide. So all my grandparents, my father, you know, all of them, they have faced injustice, war, and genocide. So unfortunately, and this is the case with a lot of other minorities in the Middle East, they try to kill us, they try to clean this ethnic minority, but each time we stand up stronger, but unfortunately we are going very, very small today. So imagine, like, from one of the very, very old religion minority in Iraq, we are less than 1 million all around the world. But we stand up stronger, we stand up, you know, for us and for the others as well.
Où est-ce que vous avez trouvé le courage, l'énergie?
How could you find the strength and the energy to enter this vocation as a journalist? You were first a victim, you were a witness, and you then decided to do something professional around these tragic events.
I was 19, 20 years, so when we escaped from my village, my parents and my siblings, I pushed them to leave home because we were not believing that such a thing will happen, like a genocide. So we were thinking that we are leaving home and we're gonna come back in the evening, but unfortunately that was the last time that we saw home. So in the beginning we were not able to realize what have happened, but then I took my family, we migrated to Turkey where we became refugees for the first time. And then I realized that I've lost everything. I've lost friends, family, home, and all my dreams that they were taking, you know, from me. All my dreams were destroyed in front of my eyes. And then I've got nothing to lose. En fait, j'ai tout perdu. J'avais
I lost everything. I had nothing else to lose. And so I decided to do something.
My family to Germany. All my family are refugees today. I put my siblings in a boat and I sent them to Germany. They ended up in Lesbos and then they went to Germany. And then I decided to go back to Iraq. I wasn't able to leave all of that behind me and to come to start a new life here in Europe. So I wanted to, it's my duty, it's my responsibility to do something, to document those crimes and then to find justice one day. So, yeah, to answer to your question, I would say I have nothing to lose, so I went to make a change.
Olive, l'Inuit Kwinga.
You are both from the same generation. Olive Linkwi-Kinga, you are the same age. How does the testimony you just heard resonate in you? And do you see a similitude in your struggles as well? What made you want to act?
There to translate. Well, merci beaucoup. And of course, good.
Well, thank you.
I was born in Cameroon, and as Adiba has explained in her story, I see little similarities, but I would say my story is more from a different dimension of the fact that I immigrated to the United States when I was 12 years old, and so experiencing such a difference in culture and a difference in mindset as well as language was a bit of a shock to me initially. And so I completed my high school, and then my mom decided to send me back in Cameroon to see the home that I kept saying I want to go back to. And what was very shocking was the fact that everything seemed in a state of stagnation, no progress, and my village was almost in a worse state than previously. And what I then realized was, why would I want to, because initially before going to Cameroon, my ambition was actually to become an astrophysicist. And in high school, I excelled in chemistry and physics and was selected to participate in the NASA competition space program twice. And so this was a trajectory that I was looking forward to. And my mom was very happy that I chose that. But upon arriving in Cameroon and at 18 and realizing the dire situation, I returned with a different mindset and more of a bigger objective to want to make change, but change not by going up in space or exploring the unknown, but more so underground and trying to see how I could contribute to improving the lives of my fellow classmates whom I had left, and it was more difficult to reconcile the fact that here was I, being taken away by my parents to a better country, gaining better opportunities, but for them, they don't have anyone who is abroad who can then come and take them out of that situation. So I felt it was my responsibility to step out of my comfort zone and choose a career where I can actually contribute in making others' lives better than myself.
And do you have any regrets?
I am still in the process of learning, so I cannot say I regret or not regret, because at the moment I'm completing a master's program in European International Governance, and this is my second master's. And initially I came here in Geneva, and some might ask, why did you leave the US to come here in Switzerland to study? Or more specifically to Geneva. And as we all know the history of what Geneva has played its role in diplomacy, I felt this is the center to come and to actually be able to touch, to feel, to see, as well as to get the complete reality of what I am going to do. Because at the moment I'm completing an internship at the United Nations Library and Archives, and it's very profound for me to get to experience the behind the scenes of what goes on, and who the people who don't necessarily get the privilege of being seen by the public, and the contributions they are making daily in the efforts of ensuring that the United Nations remains relevant despite the changing landscape of international governance and diplomacy. So as far as regrets, I would say I've actually benefited a lot, and I continue to learn as a result of being here.
You are 24 years old, if I'm right.
Yes.
What can you now consider as achievements, concrete achievements?
A concrete achievement for me, the first thing that comes to mind is actually when I was in the US in high school during my senior year. And we had, some of you might remember, the abduction of the Chibok girls in Nigeria. And so there was an initiative which I just simply was following the news, and whenever I came to school, I realized there was a huge disconnect between what my classmates perceived as education and what was ongoing. And so I then brought up to the principal, actually, of my high school, and I introduced him to the idea of me creating posters of the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls campaign, which was ongoing in Twitter, and posting it on every single classroom door. That way, I can then educate my classmates and schoolmates and let them also realize the importance of that they have of being in a premise or in a country that they have the ability to study peacefully. And so when the principal accepted, I then put these posters in all the doors of my high school, and he actually encouraged me to then host programs. So they created a period during the day where I would go to various classrooms and educate my various schoolmates about the Chibok girls, and also education in Africa in general. Despite the fact that I wasn't Nigerian, I felt this was an obligation because a lot of my classmates had little or no understanding of the world outside of them, and also the value of education. So this earned me a great award in Texas, Interscholastic Award, and of which I'm very grateful, and that has to be the highlight of my achievements so far. Thank you.
Okay, Adama, we're going to ask for your reaction too, but I'd like to go to India first, because Annie Namala, I'm not sure whether you're hearing the translation. I'm going to ask my question in French to you. I hope you can hear the translation correctly.
Hear the English translation?
Yes, I think it's good. Okay, so you can see these accounts from the two young ladies, one who's 25. You've been working for 25 years in the different areas. What can you say to these people after 25 years of commitment, of your own commitment?
Thank you. It's really very inspiring to hear the young people and the commitment and the strategies and the way they are able to take forward some very, very hard dimensions of social and gender inequalities. So I would first of all like to say that a big thank you to them, and also to the courage and the ability to move forward and take the leadership in these dimensions. So first of all, it's really a thank you for moving the agendas forward. In my own experience, as you said, 25 years, I've primarily worked with socially excluded communities in India who are called the Dalit communities and other marginalized communities. My experience is that when you are really confronted with very entrenched, deep-rooted social and gender inequalities, it is extremely important to support and facilitate leadership from the communities to raise the issues up, to bring it up to a level of articulation, to be able to make a connect with other members of the community and make the demands. I think over the last 25 years, I've seen a lot of changes where a community that has been considered bottom of society, untouchable, servitude, and almost near slave conditions have organized themselves, mobilized to, at this point, that in all our political, social, economic dialogues, the Dalit issues become an agenda. And I would also like to say that it has also found other communities that are similarly disadvantaged, similarly discriminated, and being able to build a larger collaboration across many other countries. And today I would say that even at the UN level, there is questions on the Dalit issues. Every committee, every commission does look at and question the way the discrimination is, the way the inequalities are. So I would say that bringing leadership from within the communities to raise their issues has two dimensions. One, it promotes a confidence and solidarity within the community. And secondly, I think it brings up the issues that need to be most highlighted into the forefront to be addressed. And in my experience, a lot can happen through that kind of mobilization.
Merci beaucoup, Annie.
Thank you very much, Annie. Adama, I would like to hear your reaction to this.
These testimonials, and then you'll speak about your activity for increased education and creativity. The role of creativity is for you very, very important.
Sure. Well, the first reaction is that I was proud of myself in my high school because I was a good basketball player, and I managed to get through Latin 5 years in a row. And this kind of create a completely different content. I reevaluate basically my past after your your statements. But the first reaction I had is that we spoke about, I mean, you spoke about exclusion and community that are underrepresented and discriminated and oppressed. And you made very concrete example of how does that happen physically, politically. How does it really impacted your life, you know, and you have to move, etc. I think that there is another element that happened in the area of exclusion, and it's the exclusion from the global pool of knowledge producers, and the exclusion and the underrepresentation in the global pool of ideas. What do I mean by that? If we take a website like Wikipedia, that we all now use, even the one that say they don't use it, we all know that you use it. But it's now the 5th most used website in the planet. And technically, it's one of the most democratic website that is out there, because technically anybody right now can go on Wikipedia and change and put out an article, etc., etc. But then we need to move from theory to practice. And when we go into practice, we will see that as of today, in this moment, there are more information about the city of Paris than about the entire African continent. Let it sink for a second. There's more information about the city of Paris than about the entire African continent. So now the question is, what are the effects, the consequences of this gap of knowledge? And the consequences are more concrete than what we can think of. Because you were asking me about creativity and the role that creativity can have. But the question is, where creativity comes from. Creativity is not a skill that just comes from the sky and at some point you wake up and you become creative because you put two socks on the different colors or because you're artistically creative. Creativity comes from knowledge, from a sense of self-representation. Without knowledge, there's no creativity. And without creativity, we don't have the capacity to affect the world in the way that we could. And so the importance of representation and knowledge becomes central in the development of the world. And so in this case, we decided as the Moleskine Foundation to try to be active in this space and to try to address this issue. And one of the ideas and one of the main initiatives that we run is to help young people from the African continent diaspora to transform themselves from passive knowledge consumers into active knowledge producers. And the consequences of that can be tremendous. I think, Adiba, you were talking in the beginning, and everything started from, telling the story. I need to tell the people who we are. And that passed from your capacity to produce knowledge as you're doing, but also your capacity to disseminate that knowledge. And now the great things compared to the past is that technology can help us doing that. Now the question is, technology can help us doing that, but technology, unless we are intentional about it, can just reflect the power structure of the world. So it is somehow at the center of our initiative and in the center of initiative of many other people to try to rebalance this inequality in terms of knowledge production and knowledge consumption. We need to make sure that more communities, more languages, more people can represent themselves in an effective way so that the entire world can actually benefit for all the creativity that can stem from it.
And maybe with your foundation, Moleskine and Wiki Africa, what are concrete achievements you've still done?
So, I can talk about something that we just, we worked on last year, 2020. That's probably the most concrete example that I can make. Because as many other organizations in the world, especially cultural organizations, COVID-19 really was obviously a big hit for everybody, especially for people who are used to work into physical spaces, etc. So what we did, though, we took the knowledge that we had and the experience that we had from Wiki Africa Education, and basically we run a campaign called The Solution Will Not Be Televised, where we activate a community of translators, of knowledge producers in African languages so that young people could start producing knowledge about COVID-19 in their own language. It was quite an interesting journey because in doing so, there's two things that emerge. A, it was how many people is out there that the moment that they give them a call to action, they're ready to act and to be activists. And B is also the gap that we thought we knew that it existed, it was more than what we actually could think of. Mm-hmm. When we started, on Wikipedia, there was one entry about COVID-19, and I think it was in Kiswahili. There was nothing else in African languages. And in less than 2 months, we managed to activate a community. We had more than 30 languages represented, more than 400 entries produced, all spontaneously, and suddenly, ideally, 300 million people could have access to this information from their phone. And we are not a health organization. We deal with culture. But again, our idea was connected to the fact that in order to spark creative solutions, you need to have knowledge. And that knowledge could be somehow self-produced. It can come from the bottom. And that's somehow what we learned from this initiative.
Et ça, Adiba, j'imagine que ça vous parle,
And this, Adiba, I believe, is a message that is speaking to you. Yes.
So this is something where I wanted actually to inform the world with what was happening. So therefore I started to work with international media as a freelancer journalist, but my role was not just to interview people, was not just to talk to people or to film people, but also how to make a good communication with the foreign journalists and the community who were persecuted, you know. Because you arrive here, for example, from Switzerland, and this beautiful bubble, beautiful country. You arrive to Iraq, where there is a genocide. But how are you really able to communicate with people? Are you really able to take their message straight away? But no, it was not that easy. So therefore, my rule was to make sure that the world get the right message about what was happening in Iraq. And also, on top of that, being a woman, you know, like it was always the men's job. As you all know, I came from a very conservative country, at least since I remember the war, and then the country was conservative. It was always difficult for women. And then, you know, we've got a lot of victims. We've had so many victims. But when I went back home, or when I went back to work there, I want to be there as a fighter, not as a victim, you know. We had so many. So I wanted to take the lead. I wanted to take my part and really to do something. I succeed somehow. I succeed, and I managed to do a lot of things in terms of like national level, but internationally it's still not enough, you know. So, for example, when we were in Iraq, when the genocide was happening, we were running from home, we were all expecting something here from Geneva, saying that the capital of the humanity, the capital of the world, they're gonna come to save us, they're gonna come to help us, they're gonna bring us peace, but we were wrong. And then me coming here as a refugee, I'm an asylum seeker in Switzerland, by the way, for the second time I'm a refugee. My asylum is rejected, you know. Coming here and seeing that people are really in a bubble, you know, they have no idea what would have happened there. And then when they talk about us, we are not included. And then also as a refugee, they talk about us, they make decisions about us, but without us, so we are not included. So therefore, it's my responsibility to be included there where they make decisions about us.
Annie Namala, est-ce que on parlait de l'éducation, de l'accès à l'information?
Annie Namala, we've spoken about education, access to information. Is this an objective for you, or is it also a challenge for your daily work? Les questions.
Having a voice for oneself, being able to be representing in the spaces of decision making, I think that's what we really mean when we talk about social inclusion. And that is where I think when we talk about the need for understandings to be created, expanded, that's where I think the solutions will come. And in the issues of the Dalit community, I have seen that it is when this community leadership has risen up and been able to represent themselves, take the issues up, the reality of the issues come out, the depth of the issues come out, and also solutions of the issues come out. So I would really agree that the knowledge producers and representation and being in decision-making spaces and having a voice is extremely important. And in this whole framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, I feel the Leave No One Behind principle talks particularly on this agenda, and we should take this opportunity of this framework to highlight the most vulnerable communities wherever they are and be able to raise their voices and make it heard.
Peut-être encore un mot avant de passer la parole à Gabriel Koller, un mot avec vous.
Thank you very much. Perhaps an additional word with you, Oli. What is the message you wish to share?
Tell us tonight. Like a conclusion.
Thank you for your question. And a message I would like to say tonight is one that I myself experienced, which is when I was completing my internship at the Dallas Foundation in Texas. I always assumed if a country is wealthy and it has the resources to enable that all its people have homes, have shelter, have all the needs that the world wants, or at least that we all want to achieve, that should be possible, especially in a developed country like the US. But to my shock, I did my internship, and what I realized was there's a great need, and a lot of people become almost invisible in the eyes of the world and in the eyes of their own community, simply because they don't have someone to speak on their behalf, or they don't have any representation of someone to give them the knowledge. And this was very much emphasized when I then looked at my own country of birth, Cameroon, where despite how poor we are, its homelessness is almost not so, is not rampant. And if there's ever a situation where someone doesn't have a home or doesn't have shelter whatsoever, the community tries to see what it can do to help. And so this was the huge disconnect, or I should say the breakthrough for me to realize and also to learn that despite the development goals that we have and the agendas that we're setting for the world and for humanity, we also need to look at our colleagues, each other, and ask ourselves, what are we doing to actually improve each other's lives? Because there's one thing to set agendas and to have global objectives, but if you're living in a developed country and you walk across the road and you see homeless people and that doesn't bother you, there's something wrong, because we oftentimes associate poverty and all these insecurities to developing countries like Cameroon. And so that is the greatest message I want to share, that for us to truly practice the human cause that we want to advocate for, or that we're aiming to achieve one day with the SDGs and so forth, we need to begin from home and not having a far-reaching agenda, because sometimes those who are actually far from us, they are okay in their situation. I'm not saying all the time it's good, but they're actually doing what they can with the resources they have, versus when you expect to see a country that has everything actually not necessarily caring for the most basic people. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. Gabriel, we've heard these incredible testimonies. How can we link them one with the other? What can we extract from this first dialogue?
Reports from you as young leaders and from Anina Mala as a senior leader, if I may say so. I think from your observations and your experiences and your activism, I draw 4 points. The first one is the importance of leadership, which is something that I'm an old 68 generation, and we sort of always skirt around that issue of leadership, but I think it's actually extremely important. And I think with all of you, it became very visible how important it is to have people who take up action, who have the courage to speak, who have the courage to investigate, and who have the will to make changes. The second point I take from your témoignage is really this question of how do we build coalitions? How do we reach out across different disadvantaged communities? And I think your last point, Olive, was very stirring about how we often, people of us who are in the so-called development set, we're very concerned about the low-income countries and the situation of people living in social exclusion, living in poverty in low-income countries, and will at the same time walk past people in our own country who are in equally dire situations. And this issue of leaving no one behind, including in our own direct communities, I think that's an important point. So this question of how do we coalesce across different topical issues, different types of social exclusion, be it caste system in South Asia, be it homelessness in the US, be it religious minorities who face genocide from one generation to the next, be it Africa as a continent excluded. It's not just excluded from access to the internet, the digital divide, it's also this issue that the head of the WHO keeps emphasizing now with vaccine apartheid, that in the entire African continent, 1% of the population has now been vaccinated against COVID-19, whereas in Europe, I think we're between 30 and 40%. Huge apartheid, a huge discrimination, again, leaving a whole continent behind, as it were, with a vaccine that ought to be free and accessible for all. So leadership, coalitions. I think the third point I see is around creativity. I thought that was very interesting, what you were saying, this importance of being creative, of finding new ways, which in a way interfaces with this question of building groups that can work together and doing that in unusual ways, having strange bedfellows come together, so to speak. But I think the most important point that I take from your interventions is really this question of how to get onto the agenda. And I think especially the genocide issue, what you were saying, obviously I'm aware of the Yazidi persecution. I personally work a lot on the issue of the Rohingya in Myanmar, and it's the exact same process. As a friend was just telling me about persecution that happens in other parts of Europe, in the Yugoslav war, of the genocide in Germany against the Jewish people. And it's always the same thing, that we don't see the signals of what's about to happen, and we're not aware of the genocide as it's taking place. And so this fourth point, I think, is so important in the context of what we're trying to achieve with this dialogue. We're anchoring it in a way in the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, so in a way in this multilateral way of speaking. And it really shocked me to hear how, just like the people in Myanmar who are now asking for help, responsibility to protect, and you're saying no one came to help, and you were expecting Geneva, in quotation marks, to come to the assistance, to support a people who is being persecuted and actually murdered, raped, violated, and that there was no response. And so the question is, how do we actually get to this interaction between activism, social mobilization, and then having a world-level multilateral system that actually does intervene in the correct fashion? And that is something we'd have to discuss separately. So maybe bringing it back to the point about Geneva, that some of us at least are physically in the city of Geneva. The social contract was invented here by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He only referred, I think, to governments and people, but we of course know that the climate is extremely important, so we would have a much more differentiated social contract. And we, I think, also have a very different understanding of what citizens or people are. It's everyone in the community, including people who are displaced, who are refugees. So the question is, how do we connect social mobilization of individuals, of groups, of communities who hopefully get voice, but how do they get authentic voice in multilateral processes so that their intentions, that their desires, their rights are really heard in the multilateral forum. I think that's partly what we're trying to achieve with this meeting. So let me stop there because we have so many other exciting speakers who will be addressing us. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à tous les 5 d'avoir été avec nous.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the 5 of you for having been with us. Thank you.
Nous allons bientôt parler environnement et réchauffement climatique avec de nouveaux panels.
So we're going to now talk about the planet, environment and climate change with new panelists. So please come to the floor. But before this second forum, we're going to have analysis and reflections from somebody. We talked already about this. Sir Arthur Richard Jolly, the former professor and researcher at University of Sussex. And you are with us tonight directly. Thank you very much for being here. It's over to you now.
Well, I was asked to say something about the third UN, but let me set it in context. I worked 20 years for the UN, the best years of my life, and 15 with UNICEF, seeing programs all around the world for children, and then for 5 years with the Human Development Report of UNDP, which is still the most publicized and quoted of all the international reports. And it was a great privilege to follow Mahbub al-Haq, who was the founder and creator of the Human Development Report, and indeed much of the human development paradigm, with his close friend and colleague Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize economist. I want to talk about what we learned when we studied the UN's achievements in the UN intellectual history. And our final volume, I think I put it there, UN Ideas That Changed the World. And it may be we weren't focused on ideas when we started. We were focused on the economic and social achievements and actions of the UN. Now, the importance of that is that so many of the histories, evaluations, reports of the UN have focused on the politics, the Security Council, what the UN has done in war and so forth. Important, but still only 20% of the UN's work. And 80% of the UN's work has been in areas of WHO, UNESCO, FAO, ILO, and others, including my own institution, UNICEF. What we discovered when we looked at the UN's record in the economic and social arena was that there was not one UN, but 3 UNs. And that's the point I want to make. The first UN, of course, is of governments. And governments are important, but actually in the UN, they're much less important than people thinking of their own countries and their own governments are. Why? Because there's 193 governments in the UN. They can't all agree. So of course the big powers have more influence, but not total influence, even if they cared. The second UN is very important, staff members. And staff members in governments and staff members in the UN are also important, perhaps often in the UN more important than governments. But it was the third UN that emerged from our studies as critical when we were asking what were the initiatives taken for the UN, where did the UN get its ideas from, and so forth. And if often it was not from governments, they were all disagreeing if they were there, the staff members were important, sometimes coming up with great ideas, but often it was the third UN, NGOs, peace groups, and others pushing the UN for action. And it was that third UN that often explained the important, innovative actions of the UN itself. The very idea of human development, although one might say, well, that grew surely out of UNDP. Well, yes, but it was actually Amartya Sen and Mahbub al-Haq who brought the ideas from. Amartya Sen was never formally a staff member of the UN, at least never for long. But he brought these critical ideas that really have expanded and changed the whole focus on development. When you look at human rights, of course, the UN has played the critical role in taking human rights from an idea into an action and into obligations of countries by which countries must be evaluated. But again, it was individuals pressing for human rights that really explain that critical action. And when I was glad to hear the MDGs and the SDGs mentioned, absolutely important. In the 1980s, only UNICEF really was prepared to take a global goal of immunizing all children and making it a key focus for their actions. Indeed, I remember, because I was working in UNICEF at the time, many governments, and particularly in UN, and not governments, many parts of the UN, I think particularly of UNDP. Oh no, we can't have a global goal for children or global goal for anything, because it's only countries at country level that can establish a global goal. Well, dear Jim Grant, the executive director of UNICEF in 1980s, pressed for global goals. Of course, they had to be then supported by governments, and they were. And Jim Grant showed how leadership for goals can mobilize governments to action. Then in the 1990s, UNFPA, United Nations Population Fund, joined UNICEF, and they supported. But it was really only in 2000, when the MDGs came in, that all the parts of the UN got behind global goals, including, and this was critical, the World Bank and the IMF, which until 1997, I think it was, didn't even believe in any goals at all. It was just they wanted free markets and all that sort of nonsense. So global goals came in with the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, then with the SDGs in 2015. And I'm very glad to say that they're now critical. But I come back to my first point, and the particular point I want to emphasize. Of course, the SDGs depend on government action. Of course, particularly, they depend on staff members of government taking them seriously. But above all, they depend on local communities, people, the third UN, the people power, to say, what are these SDGs mean for our community? What do they mean for our country? What do they mean for our country's aid programs and political foreign policy in support of other countries? It's the third UN that is critical. And I hope all of you listening say, what's my role in mobilizing the third UN in my part of the world or in my occupation? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Sir Richard Joly, d'avoir.
Thank you very much for speaking to us for a few minutes. But now we're going to move on to maybe the hottest topic of the evening. It was in the news before COVID-19, and COVID-19 has not taken over from this major topic. We're, of course, talking about the major issue of the future of the planet. We've had demonstrations, we've had climate strikes in the streets, and then we had political awareness. We even had a CO2 law But unfortunately, this was refused by the people 2 weeks ago. So we're going to have a debate about this. We'll look at the issues around the future of the planet, around global warming. How can we mobilize civil society around these issues? It's the same people that cause the problems with the CO2 law. And we have 4 people here with us today. We have Ocean Daya. Good evening. You are founded the Swiss Youth for the Climate, and you are co-president of Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and you're from Eco. But you have talked about the 100 most influential people in Switzerland, and you have dedicated your whole life to this fight. Yes, that's true. I've never really seen it like that, but absolutely, the environmental protection has been the guiding thread for my activities, whether in the professional field or at a voluntary level. You could call it a green thread throughout your life, maybe. Alain Frère, good evening. So you founded, along with other people, the grandfathers or grandparents for the climate, for future generations that you've been working for. So thank you for being here tonight. I'm not the founder of this movement. You were part of the creation, or you're involved. You are actually Alain Frère, aren't you? Yes. But I'm not the creator of this movement. It started in 2014, and we worked with COP21 in 2015, but I wasn't there then. It was the IPCC report in 2018, which was the big shock, and I decided then that I would join a civil society organization because I think it's more credible to deliver messages based on facts than on ideology. We also have with us tonight Sasha Gabizon from Germany. Whereabouts are you exactly? Good evening. I'm in Munich. So you're the director of Women Engage for a Common Future. You were at the Rio Summit in 1992, so it'd be interesting to find out what happened between 92 and 2021. You've been warning about the consequences of global warming, particularly for women. We'll talk about this later. And you've been advising governments. You're part of the COP climate, and you've taken part in drawing up the Sustainable Development Goals. So we can really say that you really are in the heart of this matter in terms of fighting against global warming at a governmental level.
Governmental. I do work for a non-governmental organization.
Mais il faut conseiller les gouvernements.
But you do have to advise governments, of course, about the outcomes.
Well, they might call it that. They might find us a bit pushy sometimes. We do policy advocacy. So, but yes, we give them our advice, and then we want them to take it on.
Une première réaction d'abord Océane Dayer.
First reaction from Océane Dayer. We talk in civil society about the impact that we can have. The striking example is Youth for Climate. We saw them in the streets. And do you believe that in 2021 things have changed? Is it working? Okay. I'd just like to point some things out. In 2015, I founded a youth organization called Swiss Youth for Climate, which still exists, whose main goal is to enable young people to go to COP21, where the Paris Climate Agreement was signed. And this is an organization which, over time, has made links to Fridays for Future, but it's not the same organization. So I'm too old to have founded the climate strikes. I was working already. I'm a millennial, not a Generation Z, just to point that out and make it clear. So I couldn't speak on behalf of the climate strike movement today. But of course, it's an interesting comparison because we started in 2015. I studied in environmental engineering, and I took part in a project in the Swiss Foreign Affairs Ministry with a youth organization in Switzerland, which enabled 3 young people to take part in international negotiations. In 2015, I was trained in the environment, and I thought I was going to go to COP21, but no. So that's how our commitment started, because we thought, well, if they don't want young people officially involved in that, well, we're going to go through the civil society in that way. And that time, we were extraterrestrials, really. There weren't any groups in Switzerland. Not many people were interested in it. And so from that point of view, you could say there's been an exponential growth of awareness, of mobilization within part of the youth, because often you see that in civil society movements, they're very fundamental, very important. They're the source, or the root of social change and societal change. But they don't represent necessarily the majority of people. But the movement you created in 2015, 6-7 years later, we can see that this is, in the headlines. So we can't have everybody involved in a cause, whatever the cause is. And not everybody involved in a cause can see their work rewarded by such media cover. Does that strengthen it even more? Well, yes and no. A lot of progress has been made. Climate change is very representative, but there's the biodiversity crisis as well, which goes with this issue. It's very misunderstood among the general public, and we talk a lot about this, but in reality, nothing's happening. And I think in this kind of panel, it's important to remind people that greenhouse gas emissions have not even started reducing. We're still increasing. In 2021, everything we know from the IPCC report, from the media, I think it's something that's really important to remind everybody of this, because we might say that the omnipresence of this topic in the media makes people think, well, it's okay, we're doing something about it, everything's fine. But that's not the case. It's the opposite. Is it a smokescreen? Is that what you would consider? Alain Frey? Yeah, it's a bit of a smokescreen, yeah. Thanks to the youth movement with the climate strike throughout the world, it's true that people have become more aware of global warming and the anthropic cause. We hear this a lot less about this. But it's true that our greenhouse gases are not reducing. And people don't realize how urgent it is, either among people or among politicians and leaders. And that's what we're worried about. And that's what keeps us motivated and mobilized, so that we can leave our children and grandchildren a better world. Sacha Gabizan, we hear the work from Alain Frey and Sacha Gabizan, who are not satisfied with the current situation. You've been fighting this issue since '92. Do you agree with them? Has the bar never been set in this, never been reached, or has there been some success in this area?
Thank you, Jeremy, for your question. In the Zoom, I'm hearing everything in English, so I'm going to speak English after all, and I want to respond to your question. I think indeed we have worked since Rio de Janeiro, really, when at the Earth Summit, the Convention for Addressing Climate Change was one of the outcomes of the Earth Summit, as well as the Convention for Biodiversity Protection. We've been working very hard these last 25 years. And I think we see that on the one hand, as we just heard from my panelists, we are not at all yet moving in the right direction sufficiently. But still, we have to say that many things have changed. 25 years ago, climate change was a non-topic. You know, it was not part of mainstream decision making. Now it is at the core of what is happening in our political decisions. Thanks to the amazing work done by activists and scientists, and thanks to the multilateral system, which has allowed us to come with the Paris Agreement and has allowed us to really make decisions based on science. And we see indeed that we see many good things. We are working as an organization not only to influence the UN process, where we are, of course, part of the civil society constituencies in the climate change negotiations. So we have a direct link and a space in this system, which we have gotten from Rio de Janeiro, when the major groups and stakeholders were and civil society were accepted as an important part of creating a sustainable world and addressing climate change. But we also have a lot of work locally in communities. So my organization, for example, supports every year an annual award to highlight what we call the gender just climate solutions. And we are seeing amazing work being done in indigenous communities, in forest communities, in the Congo Basin or in the Amazon Basin, and the solutions are there. And we see that, for example, you know, how to make sure that we protect the forest from bushfires in Cameroon, and how important the women are to you know, help stop these bushfires. And we know that at the same time, we need to address the social and the gender dimensions, because often the women in the communities have still very little rights, are not invited to decision making about forestry decisions. If, for example, the Ministry of Environment, you know, calls a meeting to discuss the management plan for the forest with the village, it would normally be just the men of the village, whereas the women would be much more often in the forest, because they were the ones, or they are the ones, finding the medicinal plants, fetching the water, because the forests are very important water capture areas, so that's where you find the water. And also more and more the women are involved in beekeeping and other activities which bring income from a sustainable use of the forest. Previously, they were not involved, and now we see that if we really bring the women and the young girls also into the process of decision making and sustainably using of the forest, we can reach amazing things like zero bushfires, whereas before we would have every year many bushfires. And this despite climate change, despite more and more difficult situation and more droughts, we can help reverse that trend. But you really need everybody on board, and you really need to listen to the indigenous communities, the indigenous women, and especially also involve the youth and young girls. And there you have to always make the link to the social aspects. I mean, when we work and support these organizations on the ground, we'll also work on ending early marriage, underage marriage, or access to sexual and reproductive health services, because that has to be part of a sustainable solution to their local climate change challenges. I can tell you many more examples, but I just want to say that we do see amazing things happening on the ground in the communities. We have also a framework at the global level. What we now need is to stop the really negative influence of investors. Why are we still spending billions on fossil fuel subsidies? Why are our pension funds still investing in fossil fuels? Why are we spending so much money on soybean production to feed the pigs in the Netherlands? I'm from the Netherlands, we're the biggest exporter of meat in Europe. Why are we still supporting that with our public money? So if we really want these solutions to happen, we also have to address very quickly these negative actors, and we need to, stand up, and we have sometimes to go to court like the court case against Shell in the Netherlands, which was won by the civil society petitioners. We were all joining as a co-plaintiff against Shell. And you need to get that type of action moving because there is no time to lose. We have 5 or 7 years left until we have irreversible climate change. So, I'll give the floor back to you. I'm speaking a bit long, maybe.
Merci beaucoup pour ce témoignage.
Thank you very much for this important testimony, Sasha. I would like for us to go back to the awareness on the government level because civil society has been extremely active this past few years. We've just heard Alain Fraisse saying that he didn't wish to commit to within a political party. Océane Dayer, do you also believe that the work is no longer done within political parties, that it is on the ground with civil society that things can move forward? Well, I think we do not have the luxury to choose a single path. It is obvious that every individual must take a decision in every single action taken when one consumes, when one buys a product. But the issue is that today we still live in a system where it is simple and less expensive to act in a way that affects negatively the environment than to be mindful of it. So this is where policies and framework proposals are important. We have incentives that are so negative and perverse that go in the wrong direction, and it is impossible as a society to have on one hand a policy that is extremely frail, or on the contrary that that encourages us in subventions to fossil fuels that are in the billions all around the world. It's not possible to have a Swiss financial markets that still invest, and we need to say, do not take your car, but we cannot do it in a way that is incoherent when faced with a framework convention and say, we need the street, we need policies, we need economy, we need the legal system. There are laws. I will take another example that is completely linked to the environment. We have a law in Switzerland on the protection of the environment, which is constantly not respected, for instance, within the framework of agriculture. And we have billions of subventions that go in an agriculture that is problematic, that keeps us from reaching our objectives in terms of climate change. We must be brave. We must look with the courage at these political incoherencies. And this is where the framework agreement on climate are particularly interesting, because they have a holistic approach that allows us to point these incoherencies. And we must have the courage to look at these conflicts and to take them on. And I think that policies and politics have an important role to play in that. Alain Frey? They do have a role to play. Unfortunately, there is a great inertia. We cannot only have the streets. We cannot only have the action of civil society. We need a political dynamic, and which is why Grandparents for Climate, as well as other organizations, have taken a position during the elections at different levels, cantonal, federal, last year. But there was a wave of elected officials who go in the sense of our concerns, but unfortunately they remain a minority. And on this game of political combat, on steroid political combat, it's as if two football teams working together. We go in the same direction. There are struggles. We must hit the goal. We must mark goals, and the objectives. The goal here is to move beyond this dynamic that affects climate change. And the latest report from the IPCC that has leaked last week in the press indicates that we only have 5 to 7 years left before implementing the right measures, before irreparable damages are done, and this will cause great suffering. Océane Dayer, it seems that the message is not getting through to the population. Alain Frey is saying, did a call to violence, some personalities were elected. We've spoken about the green wave, where there are green electorate on the right, on the left. It is not something that belongs to a single political party, but Alain Frey says that they remain a minority in the parliament. Why isn't it going through to the population? Well, I think that we are confronted with the question of climate change and the crisis of biodiversity. We are confronted to a great challenge, which is that of perspective, time perspective. We have the amazing privilege in Switzerland of saying that if we want to see the effects of climate change, but it's still quite easily we can still quite easily close our eyes, and this is not the true everywhere in the world. And unfortunately, the people, the communities and the places in the world that are most affected are not those who mostly contributed to climate change. So there is, with time, there is a true, there are daily challenges in terms of life, and then the the privilege of wanting to preserve what some call a good life on earth, and to question privileges and processes. And the second challenge is that of costs, because we've seen so during the latest campaign around the CO2 law, which was rejected in Switzerland. We see it every time we're speaking about the environmental issues. We say the question of cost. You're not going to pay 3 additional cents on gas, and it is done in a way that is extremely targeted and extremely clear by oil lobbies that have a lot to lose by society, if society were to lead the change to the ecological transition. And so they're revealing fears with such economic challenges. But what we have said is that not doing anything is so much more expensive. And this is something that we have not yet managed to bring into this debate that is about counting cents. We've seen that a number of cities are presenting their climate plan of action, and these are very local measures, and obviously we need the entire world to participate. But we've seen Geneva, Lausanne, and others, metropolises here in the French-speaking Switzerland. We've seen that these climate plans can be rather ambitious. And do you feel that these climate plans of actions are just a Band-Aid on an open wound? No, I think those are great. We see it not only in Switzerland, but worldwide. Cities are taking the leadership in climate action. It is great, but I go back to what we say earlier. We need actions on all institutional levels. We need action on all geographical levels. And cities acting is something fantastic, but it will not be enough, because if we take the question of mobility in Switzerland, most of the mobility is managed on a federal level, and therefore we must act on all levels. And in a state of emergency, all actions are necessary. I remember participating in the UN library on a discussion on climate change, and a person who was working for the IPCC said that every second counts, every degree counts, every 100th of a degree counts, and this is the true scientific reality. So there are no small reductions. There are no actions are useless. We've expected so much, and now we must use every tool at our disposal.
Would you like to say anything in response? I completely agree with what she said. But we would like to have a government. I don't like making comparisons, but this is a fight which is about saving people's lives and defending ourselves against a very significant threat. So we would like our government to speak to the population, to say that there is a climate emergency. We need to take things in hand. Sasha, the parallel with the COVID crisis is not very veiled. Well, they've been able to do it for COVID-19, for the crisis. Sacha Gabizon, the governments were able to react in an emergency with strong measures for COVID, for the planet, for the environment. Is that what we need to do?
Yeah, many people have already mentioned that parallel, that of course, indeed, if we can do it for COVID, we must also be able to do it to save humanity. We know that we have indeed to address several crises at the same time. We have to address the COVID crisis, which might also have come out of the bad management of our biodiversity. We have to address the climate crisis with great speed, but we also have to address the biodiversity crisis, which might have been at the beginning of the COVID crisis. And unfortunately, what we see is that sometimes we have climate investments to green projects, which are supposed to support climate action, which at the same time are not good for biodiversity. And that's why I think it's so important that we always look at making sure that our investments for climate change are really sustainable and that they are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals really give us the framework to make sure that our climate action does not, on the one hand, destroy part of the forest or so which we depend on. For example, we see investments in carbon capture in the form of mono-tree plantations, and we see wrong incentives being given. Instead of really protecting the communities who live in the primary forest, we see investment projects which are maybe really harmful to biodiversity. And so we really need to make sure that climate and environmental protection go hand in hand. And we know that we need to look also beyond just fossil fuel use. It's not only about changing our mobility and our heating systems, it's also about our consumption and production. And one of the big sources of fossil fuel use is plastics, for example. I just want to give that as an example. We have started producing plastic in 1907, and it's only since the year 2000 that we have produced 50% of all the plastic in the world. And most of that is ending up in our rivers, oceans, and in our bodies. And it's dispersing around the environment. It's a huge problem for the oceans. And we need the oceans also to fight the climate. So it's all linked. And we really need to phase out production and consumer products which are based on the fossil fuel cycle. So it's not only about ending the type of cars we're driving in. It's really also about a major change in consumption and production. And that in the end needs to go hand in hand. And that's why I call on the importance of really keeping also the climate debate linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, because there we can make sure that we have changes and policies that are in line with biodiversity protection and in line with social equality. Now, we have to make sure that the transition we're asking people to make is a just transition. Yeah, if farmers are in a really bad position at the moment because they have invested so much in unsustainable production methods, we need to find a way to support these farmers to transit to ecological farming and the use of renewable energy. And that just transition, I think, is still very difficult to do. We cannot just force it through. We really need to have the communities joining themselves and supporting their solutions. And sometimes, indeed, we need to be rebels and we need to change the laws. My friends who are working on renewable energy, for example, in the beginning, they were not able to reuse their own produced renewable energy in their homes because it would be against the law and against the tariff agreements. You need to change the tariff laws. You need to change the laws. And to do that, you often need rebels to start rebelling against the laws, which are not in favor of this really huge transition we need to achieve climate protection to support the planet and our survival on that planet.
Merci beaucoup, Sacha Gabizon. J'ai envie de juste donner le mot de la...
Thank you very much, Sacha Gabizon. Oceane Dayer, civil society mobilization, what do we still need to do? We've talked about policies. What can we do at our level now to commit? Can we go out into the streets? Well, yes, we all live in communities. We have families and friends. I think trying to give this message roots. We often have panels like this where we're all saying the same thing. We said 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we were saying all these things, but I don't know, maybe we need to make this more emotional in our communities. We need that to take root in our communities. They're not just words. It's a responsibility that we have together, all humans on the world, and that's something we can do. And the last thing is that in Switzerland, we have this privilege to have a semi-direct democracy, and you can do things from your own sofa. You can vote, you can elect people who take the climate crisis seriously, and you can change your bank as well, just from your own sofa. You can put your money in a bank which has decided to respect people and the planet from your own sofa. It's very simple. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alain Frey. Thank you, Osendaye and Sachin Gabizon from Germany. We're going to now move on to our third and last panel. Thank you very much. Please, for the people, can you come and sit down for the third panel? This is on prosperity and economic inequalities. We will introduce you now. Some of you are with us here, direct, and some of you are remote. We have Patrick Taran. Welcome. You are the president of Global Migration Policy Associates, specialist in international migration. Used to work at the International Labour Office. Chantal Peyer, who is here as well. Good evening. You are head of Enterprise and Human Rights team at the Bread for Everybody NGO, and you had an important role in the Responsible Multinational Initiative, which, we can remind you, refused and good evening, Raymond Saner. You are the director for the Center for Socio-Economic Development, CEST, and you worked with the United Nations on the Sustainable Development Goals for companies. How can we improve international treaties? What we've done, what we can still do, what can we do in terms of financial management? That's very interesting because we can see there's a lot of rules which exist, and we just need to apply these now, and that's often where the problem lies. And we also have on via Zoom Sangali, who's going to be joining us at the end of the discussions and taking the floor for the conclusions. And from Mexico, Andrea Santiago, you are a lawyer. Can you hear us? So we're going to be speaking to you on your fight for domestic workers' rights in Mexico City. You have enabled, as a lawyer, protection to be put into the law for domestic workers in Mexico City. It's a very important victory. Maybe I'd like to start with you, Andrea Santiago. That's part of the good news we've had in this debate, the concrete results from your commitment, and you have been working on this fight regularly. You fight in the face of justice at the Supreme Court, and they gave you, they awarded you for this. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, well, I will highlight like 3 very important moments where I had the opportunity to participate in these major changes we had in Mexico in order to recognize domestic workers' basic rights. And the first one was at the beginning of 2018, when we saw a historic opportunity to push forward legal changes that were denying domestic workers' rights through the ratification of the ILO Convention 189. So the context was very strategic because we had the presidential elections very near. So the government at that time was leaving, and in 2014, that government had made a public promise to ratify the ILO Convention. So that was a key moment for the government in office to capitalize the ratification, and for us as organizations to strategically use this moment for our own purpose. So we had many allies, also many female legislators from different parties. that were also supporting the cause. So we designed and we coordinated this strategy to ratify the ILO Convention before the presidential transition. And we joined efforts with other key organizations. And during 3 months, like very intensively, we worked in 3 main things. First, we carried out a campaign to raise awareness of the ILO Convention and its importance. We also met with key decision makers to show the economic and the social viability to ratify the ILO Convention. And also we carried out different symbolic actions with domestic workers to publicly demand the ratification. So in this month, our goal was not achieved at that time, despite the great support we had from diverse media, academic, civil society, and international organizations during this month. But in spite of all, we managed very important things. One is that for the first time in the presidential elections, the candidates were talking about domestic workers and the ILO Convention. Two, we implemented a very coordinated strategy that helps us to unite forces to make our voices heard. And also we gained many allies in the way. So after this, the second and very crucial moment I identified was in 2018, was the social mobilization we carried out in order to publicly protest against a court judgment that was denying domestic workers an equal access to social security. So with the alliances we have already built and with the support of some journalists and human rights defenders, we managed and we made a great public noise to change this very discriminatory sentence of the court. And because of this public pressure and public mobilization, the court announced that a very profound review must be conducted. And after 2 months, the court announced a radical change. They declared unconstitutional that domestic workers were excluded to mandatory social security, and they gave the instruction to the Mexican Social Security Institute to implement a pilot program for domestic workers' access to social security, and they also established a period of 3 years to transform federal laws in order to guarantee mandatory social security for this sector. So we were super happy. I also have to mention the importance of Alfonso Cuarón film Roma in this context. Of course, having him as an ally of the domestic workers' cause was also key at that moment. And I would say that the last moment and crucial moment for defending domestic workers' rights being recognized by law was all the work we did with female legislators of all parties to transform federal laws that were still denying basic rights to domestic workers. So we sat with these legislators, we worked with them. We also analyzed the articles in the laws that were discriminatory. And finally, we presented the initiative to reform these laws with our support. So the reforms were accepted, and in 2019, domestic workers' rights were recognized by law. And finally, in December of 2019, the ILO Convention was also ratified once the political and social context had already changed profoundly, and the major changes in the law were already achieved. So I would say about these changes, like some of the learnings and some of the obstacles we face. One is that it is very difficult to have an impact in transforming legislations when there is no political will. And also when there are so many social demands and a context of race inequality. So whose voice is going to be heard when there are so many social exclusions? It's a challenge. It's a big challenge. However, I think that building alliances with different sectors and with different actors, even those alliances that you build inside the government, are key to have profound transformations. And also, one of the things we learned a lot was that constructing a closed narrative is fundamental in order to raise this awareness, because it is very difficult to talk about international conventions if we do not connect with people's realities. So in this sense, I think that there is also a very, it is necessary a pedagogical effort, and we need to build strong messages that can lead to individual and social reflection. And fourth, I think that it's very important to take advantage of historic opportunities. Cuarón's film at the moment, the presidential elections, all of the potential allies we had at the time. And I know that if we had not been there and if we hadn't been so persistent, it would have been very difficult to have the impact that we had in order to change this very discriminatory law. So I would say that. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Andrea Santiago. On peut l'applaudir pour cette belle victoire, en tout cas, devant la loi.
Thank you very much, Laura Santiago. We can applaud you for this decision, Andrea Santiago. Patrick Theran, we've spoken about the importance of civil society to struggle against social inequalities, and we'd like to hear your response after that.
Being a bit sharper on what we're talking about. For me, civil society and the civil society I've been working with now for literally 47 years is communities organizing around, and it's not prosperity, it's around survival. It's around justice. It's around community needs and making sure that people are treated equally, that their human rights are respected, that our communities' human rights are respected, and that people have a decent life and decent work. And I want to say in that context, and with that lead question and with what Andreas just said, that in my experience, it's about organization. It's not just mobilization or the street, which in some ways is the last step. It's about starting organizing week by week, day by day, month by month, year by year, organizing community, providing the knowledge that Adama, sharing the knowledge and encouraging the community to build its own knowledge, as I think Adama said very eloquently a little bit earlier. And it's about agency, and I mean agency in the sense that it's not speaking for someone else. It's supporting our own communities to speak for themselves. And I think, Adiba, you very eloquently spoke about your role and about the role of people taking initiative in their communities and working with their communities. So it's not somebody else charitably from above saying, oh, we're going to help you poor, vulnerable people. It's about us helping and organizing ourselves and taking that. And I want to pick up on a question you asked a couple of other people to say, in my experience, what that can mean. And I'll just say decade by decade, an accomplishment or two that I've been involved with. In the 1970s, pushing the US government that wouldn't do so to actually admit 600 political prisoners out of the jails of Chile and bring them to the United States and resettle them so they could build a new life and become successful and continue to engage with their own country and with the country they came to. In the 1980s, I was part of a mobilization that literally stopped an invasion. You didn't hear about that because it didn't happen. But the US had fleets off of both sides of Nicaragua when the Sandinista elected government was in power. And I heard from, I would say, intelligence sources that I had some contact with, that some governments were afraid there was going to be a major invasion. We saw before in Vietnam from the US side, afterwards in Iraq. But it didn't happen because at one point, with years of work, of solidarity work, of community work, we were able to mobilize 250,000 people, 250,000 people to Washington, D.C. to say no intervention. And I think the result of that was that the government took notice and said there's going to be too much political dissension in our country if we go ahead with what they were going to do. In the 1990s, I was part of, and I was worked with the World Council of Churches at the time, I was part of building a global ecumenical movement that actually mobilized churches and other faith groups. In fact, we had a Muslim-Christian dialogue at one point about solidarity with migrants and refugees, and mobilizing faith communities to actually get succor and support for refugees, to support and advocate for the rights and the defense of migrants, and so on. And perhaps the most recent accomplishment was being co-founder and moderator of the steering committee for the promotion of the ratification of the Migrants' Rights Conventions, which got perhaps the most difficult of the 9, or most challenging of the 9 United Nations Conventions on Human Rights into force. When it was adopted, some governments said it'll never enter force. It now has 55 ratifications, and here I'm talking about the International Convention for the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families. And I think all of that, and I'll come back to a comment that earlier one of the panelists made, which is the question of alliance building and coalitions. It's not just one group or a few individuals. It's really mobilizing, organizing communities, building organizations that have a standing. And I would say 5 fundamental things are part of it. It's not only about knowledge, it's about values. It's organizing around justice. And I think Oceane made an interesting reference to that in the previous panel. It's about justice, it's about human rights, it's about community, it's about community welfare, it's about dignity and equality of treatment for everyone. And that's what people organize around. So I would just add then, it's about, as well, that agency. It's about inclusion. Also, Adam, I think, and other people in the first panel talked about the fundamental notion of inclusion. I'll leave it at that. It's just to push out some ideas on what we're talking about when we talk about civil society, about mobilization, about organization, and about the rights, dignity, and welfare of everyone on this planet.
J'ai envie de vous passer la parole, Raymond, puisqu'on parlait d'organisation.
We've been talking about organization. Raymond, you know a lot about how this works and treaties. There's a long way to go to fight against all these inequalities, and we see that COVID has not improved the situation from this respect. But is there a basis that we have to share? Is the direction that we're going in together? Can you feel this energy?
Je pense. Mais tout
I think so, yes. But firstly, I wanted to say, Jeremy, it's a pleasure to see you here. Normally, I listen to you, I see you on the screen, and I really appreciate all the programs that you've organized. I'd like to thank the organizers as well for inviting me here to talk about a topic which is really important to me. I'm going to continue in English because I think of all those people listening to us far away, and it's an issue which has specific terminology, and I want to be sure that I'm not going to make a mistake or confuse what I'm saying and the message I want to put forward. No.
There was a certain gentleman called Milton Friedman. He got a Nobel Prize for being an excellent economist, one people thought at that time. And he came up with this saying, among other excellent books. But he also coined the term, business is in business to do business. And that's all. Well, if we continue with this interpretation of what the private sector is all about, of course, we got a little problem. And that is, if it leads to profit maximization for the shareholders who own a company, then of course all our discussions maybe are in vain. Because we know that some companies produce so-called externalities, right? They produce polluted water, air that we can't breathe. They say yes to work conditions which are horrible. There are certain things they are not obliged to improve or to do differently because there's no law which says thou shalt not do this extreme form of exploitation of nature as well as of human beings. Now, I'm not saying private sector and business are all evil beings who just are out only on making a buck and wanting to, stash money into their pockets and be profit maximizers. There are many decent, excellent business people who also bear in mind there is more to being in business than just to make money. A lot of them came up with the idea of corporate social responsibility. That is basically the idea that a company can also do good for society while at the same time be in business. It's not a contradiction. Right? However, as was the surprise of a gentleman called Emmanuel Faber, who was the CEO of a big transnational company called Danone. He was into corporate social responsibility. However, a small group of shareholders who really still kept with Milton Friedman's concept that a business is just there to make money, nothing else. The rest should be done by others, meaning society or maybe missionaries or whatever, who can take care of the damage caused if we don't take into account the whole idea of what business means. He got ousted in March, and immediately the share price of Danone went up by 2.3%, which of course is understandable to some extent. If the company does not anymore, quote, waste money doing corporate social responsibility, it will generate a higher profit, which could be beneficial for the shareholders. There's something about corporate social responsibility. There is the risk that some shareholders don't like it, or that the CEO gets replaced and the next one will go back to old-style business as business and nothing else. So people have thought about what could be done that's more consistent, more sustainable, and less dependent on one man or woman who has maybe great ideas, tries to implement it, but then gets ousted. So people have thought about it, including our governments. And the first initiative was 10 years ago at the level of the United Nations. There was this thing called United Nations Guiding Principles of what business should do in regards to respecting human rights. This has been accepted by all of the 193 governments, and in that sense is being implemented, or a lot of governments and countries try to implement these guiding principles. But there is also, of course, more to being a good company. To do good, to respect certain conditions which are good for the company and also for society. So there is something else called the OECD Guiding Principles for Responsible Business Conduct. It's a long formula, but basically it means also for business to respect, for instance, human rights. And in addition, it has a broader scope to also not engage in environmental pollution or activities which could harm the environment. Also not to practice corruption. Also, in that sense, not to use too much tax evasion to reduce the income that maybe local communities could expect from the activities of a transnational company. So, in other words, it's broader than the United Nations Guiding Principles. It's a bit more consistent than corporate social responsibility. But unfortunately, only 40 countries have signed up to it. There are still, the UN that means 193 countries. There are countries such as China. We think about China as a competitor. Well, to some extent, the idea of doing things more reasonably, more mindfully, to be sustainable. Of course, some companies, rightfully so, say, well, if we all do this, we'll have more costs, as I mentioned before with the CEO of Danone. So, why should we do all this when the Chinese and the Russians and all the others and the Indians, they don't practice the same rules? We'll become less competitive. So we'll have to further discuss, how do we create something which makes sense for the survival of the planet, but also for the dignity of the people who are also practicing, of course, business, but also are in that sense consumers, and also expect some certainty that we don't run into eco-suicide, but there is a future for the next generation. Now, things have further improved from my point of view. It's one thing to have good intentions, like corporate social responsibility. It's another to meet at the UN and to agree on treaties. But treaties like the UN and at the OECD are non-binding. In other words, nobody is obliged to actually implement them. They're meant to be good ideas. So the final step is what is now particularly happening in the Netherlands. The Netherlands are really ahead of us compared to other countries, including my own Switzerland. They have passed national laws. And based on national laws, one being, for instance, we, Netherlands, we have signed up to the Paris Agreement. So be it. Let's do it. They passed a law which expects companies to not be CO2 emissioner, to do things which I already now described to you about the OECD guidelines. They have now taken to court a big bank, for instance, ING. And ING had to accept that its annual publication, which reports about what the company is doing, was not good enough. Simply was a bit of greenwashing and bluewashing. That they would be more specific as to what they do in terms of trying to reduce CO2 emissions. And, which is never happened yet before anywhere else, that the bank itself, over the next 6 years, will gradually move out of investing in the coal industry. We had a similar rule also recently in the Netherlands about Shell. And Shell had to agree to reduce its CO2 emissions. I forgot, but I think 35% over the next 4 years. These are tremendous steps forward, from my point of view, to turn everything we talked about that we want to do to make the world a better place, to actually do it. And to let business, as well as society, know what is expected. So we are specific, and it helps investors and business to know what the rules are of doing business, and it's not just to be in business for business. That concludes my contribution.
Merci beaucoup, Raymond.
Thank you very much, Raymond. We're going to hand over to Chantal Piaget now, because you have just finished a very intense campaign on the issues of multinationals. And we know that in Switzerland we have a whole host of multinationals, a lot of head offices here with operations in different countries. So for your fight was so that these businesses could respond to what they have done abroad here in Switzerland. This was a very intense campaign for you. Did the mobilization around this campaign give you concrete outcomes? can we see concrete outcomes now, even if it was refused?
Je vais parler en anglais. On m'a demandé de parler en anglais pour le panel, comme tous les autres intervenants parlaient anglais. First, I think it's important to understand that we actually won because we had a majority of Swiss citizens of 50.7% saying yes. And I think it's extremely important. We failed because we didn't have the majority of the states, which we need in an initiative. But this was made in the second wave of COVID crisis. And to have one citizen out of two in a country like Switzerland, where multinational corporations are extremely dense, and many people work in those corporations saying, we want laws so that those companies respect human rights and the environment also abroad, also in the Congo, also in China. I think this was really a huge change of state, of mindset for the Swiss citizens. And I think that was very important. What is a pity is that I think the political world hasn't understood that yet. I mean, our Conseil fédéral, who now have done a counter project which we consider won't have the impact to really diminish human rights violation, and they have made a proposal on ordonnance how to implement their proposal. It will not be effective because what we came to the conclusion, and that's really a bit of follow-up of what you said, and we did research for years, many NGOs, and I mean all over the world. And what we saw is that those people in companies are not evil. It's just a system. And the system of the company, I mean, Friedman said the business of business is business. And what we hear often is that now CSR is win-win. If companies take care, it will be good for them. But it's not what we see on the ground. We do really research in the DRC, and years after years, I mean, subsidiaries of Swiss companies, they're owned by Swiss people, I mean, or at least by Swiss, they're based in Switzerland. They pour really polluted water into the rivers, or they have emissions which damage the health of the citizens or the communities living around. So, and we can do reports. We can do reports that are on TV, Swiss TV, sometimes BBC, but it doesn't really change the reality on the ground. So it's really a political debate. It's a debate that citizens have to say in which frame and with which rules can companies operate or not. And what we say is simply that it's an illusion to believe that they will do the right thing, not because they are bad people, because there is a system which is short-term. You have shareholders in those companies that want every 3 months a report. And Emmanuel Faber, and also the CEO of Unilever at that longer ago, said, I won't do financial report every 3 months, but only every 6 months. But I mean, that's the logic of those companies. And it's always been that the citizens say in which frame those companies, I mean, they are giants, they're more powerful than states today, can operate. And in that sense, to do now the link with the topic of the evening, citizen mobilization is absolutely central. And I think if there is one thing we can be proud about with this campaign on responsible business, is that we managed to mobilize the Swiss citizens, not just because we can have a vote when we have 100,000 signatures, but because we created local committees where people discussed about these issues. We had the churches, and this was afterwards a big polemic, but churches supported this change of the law. They put banners on the churches to say, yes, we want responsible businesses in Switzerland. We had people putting also banners on their balcony. So there was really a mobilization that was new. And one very important thing as well, we had money because a lot of citizens gave us money. And this money is not money because NGOs are rich. It's because really people gave us 10, 20, 30 francs because they wanted that we have money to do a good campaign. And I think that was really shows the power that even in a democracy like Switzerland, civil society can have to mobilize to change the law. Now the challenge, and I would also like to underline this, is when you start to become powerful, even in a really great democracy like Switzerland, because it's a great democracy, there are several people that don't like it. And what we saw, I mean, even in Switzerland, is that because we won 50.7% of the population, because we had gathered a lot of money to do this campaign, but it was money given by the citizens. We had a huge backlash in Parliament against NGO a week after the vote. So we had 12 interventions in Parliament where people and politicians said NGOs, even if they build a well in Africa, if they become money from the government, you know, to do solidarity project, they should not be allowed to take part in public debates anymore in Switzerland. And I think that's very preoccupying as well, and we also have to debate this, is that civil society has a very big capacity to mobilize, but there is also a lot of resistance, and there can be also a very, and that's a really worry at the moment, I think in the whole world, there is a shrinking space as well for civil society. And in many countries, not only to mention China, there is a huge backlash on civil liberties and the ability of civil society to mobilize.
Merci beaucoup Chantal Payer d'avoir partagé avec nous ce témoignage.
Thank you for Chantal Payer for sharing. The program moves forward, and we must give the floor to Sang-Geun Lee, who is with us with Zoom. You are the responsible of the Department on Employment at the ILO. What can we say about the testimonies we just heard?
First of all, I'm very happy to be at this meeting, and I want to thank Alejandro for inviting me to this meeting. I just want to make 2 points based on the very rich and very constructive, actually, the conversation we have heard from this panel. Number one is, I strongly believe there is a growing need for the civil society and the social mobilization at all levels. Number two, and actually there are so broad areas for the social society can do. So I just mentioned very quickly on these 2 points. The first, when we look at the globalization, we know the globalization is related to the economic inequalities, but at the same time, the evidence is very clear, the globalization is also associated with the centralization and also weakening the community and civil society in many parts of the world. This is Patrick's point as well. But if a recent book, for example, by the Raghuram Rajan, the former governor of the central bank in India, he actually published a very interesting book with the title of the third pillar, which actually refers to civil society. So his book has a very interesting subtitle, which says the revival of community in the polarized world. I think this theme was interestingly taken up by the former governor of the central bank, this time the UK, Mark Carney. I mean, there are some others, they're all talking about the same thing. To actually address the globalization and economic inequality, we have to find a way of reviving community and civil society. It's all clear. And global level, I hear the same thing. I think interestingly, I just heard Sir Richard Jolly's point about the third United Nations. The third UN is actually the civil society. I completely agree on that point. I mean, right now, we have to find a way of reinforcing this power. This is very much echoed the Raymond's point about civil, the business and the CSR, and also Chantal's point about the ongoing tensions with the state, with the market, on the civil society. It has been always there. Right now, the overall civil society in some countries, Switzerland, remains strong and not necessarily in other countries. It's really time to act upon it, especially as a way of addressing one of the crucial issues of the green transition and also economic inequality in general. The second issue I want to mention is that there are really broad range of the issues that civil society can make a difference on. I think Andrea mentions her excellent campaign on the domestic world, but I just want to complete that story. The very convention, the Convention 189 on the domestic world, adopted by the ILO, which was really thanks to the civil society themselves. I was sitting on the secretariat of the discussion on this very convention. I was so impressed, sometimes overwhelmed with the strong voices from civil society. They are the one who actually convince the trade unions and also business and eventually the governments to support this actually international standard. In the beginning, we are all skeptical about this, but thanks to the huge mobilization from the civil society at the national level and the global level and also local level, this convention eventually came to reality. So this is one example. Another example is child labor. Global campaign on child labor is really the flagship program of the ILO. Once again, this is thanks to the civil society and all the global supply chain issues, for example, the good working conditions, safety and health in the global supply chain. Once again, without actually big support or big push from the civil society, we wouldn't have a very strong program and policies we have right now. The Raymond mentions about the very difficult situation with the business. I mean, what actually the civil society did in the case of the global supply chain, they brought in the consumers into the picture, and that's a way of the realigning the business interest with actually the public or social interest, and then pushing for the government. At the local level, one interesting example is we are having really difficulty with the safety and health for workers. But here again, our local civil society, local community, they know the situation very well. They are working with the labor inspectors, for example, to provide a good way of the resolving or improving the situation. And this is a good example of what actually Patrick mentioned, how we can bring in knowledges with the value and to make a difference. I think that's important. One last point I want to make very quickly is that we are now in a huge job crisis and crisis in the livelihood. Once again, I think civil society can work together with all different the peoples and to actually, to produce, to actually create a bit of the human-centered recovery for everybody. I think the civil society has done before, but now it's a bit context is a bit different. But I think it's a huge potential for the civil society. But to be honest, we need the civil society much stronger, more effective, and much broader than before. For actually this actually difficult time and also for the recovery. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Sanguin. Merci beaucoup d'avoir été avec nous. Merci.
Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you to Chantal, Patrick, Raymond, and Andrea for taking part in this last panel. So now we're going to hear from 4 young people, Sheila Alberta Bassayan, Lucia Gobelin, and Chiara Mula, to talk to us about the outcomes of an online survey for millenniums on their civil society mobilization. So thank you very much to all 4 of you for being here. I think one is remotely. So over to you now.
To everyone. Je suis désolée, je ne peux pas parler.
I'm sorry, I can't speak French, but I'm going to speak in English. You're not the only one here tonight, don't worry.
Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Sheila Baldion. I'm Peruvian, currently a candidate of the May program of the University of Geneva. And today I will present a brief overall of the survey that it was launched for Greycells. And it was an online survey launched by social media using Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. This survey has this kind of information that is really relevant for us that we want to share about. Includes information from millennials to elders, people from 20 years old to more than 65 years old, employed, students, retired. Also, we have seen that most people who respond this survey was people from Europe. And also we have that a really important issue in this survey that I can highlight is that people are moving from different parts of the world to Europe. So immigration is a subject that is really important, and I think that we can work together for it. And we have seen in the first part of the dialogue with some experience of people who were sharing their experience about migration. And I think there is an important issue. And I will pass the word to my colleague to continue with the information about the survey. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I am Albert from Fair Internship Initiative. Thank you very much also Greycells. It's already the second time that we are working together for this. I think everyone here more or less knows about Fair Internship Initiative. We are the group behind pushing for paid internships in Geneva, but also in other duty stations. Every 20th of February on the World Social Justice Day, we are doing global interstrike this time. And we have achieved big results so far. Almost half of UN agencies are already paying their interns. Now we are focusing on the UN Secretariat, and hopefully super soon in the next resume session of Fifth Committee, member states, 193, all of them will agree on abolishing unpaid, unfair internships. And our initiative's goals are quite important also in the context of the survey that Greycells has launched, is because what we are discussing here all day is about how civil society organizations are influencing decision-making at the international level, at the UN level. On the other side, how the UN is actually empowering civil society movements across the world. So what we are doing from case example, Fair Internship Initiative, we are former or current UN interns who understood at some point that UN is not always in line with its own values, with its own goals, with its own mission statements. I mean, UN is doing a lot of great things, but on that small thing, UN was not doing right things. So we said, okay, we need to mobilize and we need to actually change the current status quo on unpaid internships. So now we are moving forward. You know, in 2018, it was World Health Assembly. It was a big thing, adopted unanimous resolution on banning unpaid internship. Now WHO interns are actually receiving very good stipend. Other agencies, UNDP, UNICEF, UNHCR has also adopted such policies. So what we are saying is that once UN Secretariat also adopts a resolution banning unpaid internships, UN will have, as a global norm-setting organization, a moral authority to push for-profits and non-profits alike across the world and empower hundreds of millions of young people. Only in the European Union there are 5 million unpaid interns right now, and I don't know any statistics from China or from India. This is a big issue. This is not only about interns issue, it's about like the labor market, and this is about our future. So from the survey part, we have asked several interesting questions, whether people are participating, millennials and seniors alike, in the civil movements. And we got very rich replies from their side. People are participating in social movements regarding social justice rights, labor rights. We had some replies from UN staff members who are lobbying both administrations at the UN in Switzerland and in France. You know, a lot of people are living also in the France voisin, so it was important thing. There is development area, water and sanitation, food for all. There is environment issues. For example, someone was involved in the movement aimed at stop cutting trees in the neighborhood, but also Fridays for Future. So you see, like on one side, you are going to the streets, you are fighting for the climate, but then you are also doing very local thing, just stopping trees in your neighborhood to be cut. Then there is money investment. You know, there are so many initiatives who need some financial support. So we asked people if they were satisfied with the money that they were giving. Maybe you have experienced recruiters coming and asking money for Médecins Sans Frontières, for UNICEF, for all other these non-profit organizations, most of people were satisfied. It was very interesting that some were actually saying that from the giver's perspective, it's a bit difficult to put pressure on the non-profits to report very regularly because it will put more administrative pressure on them. So people are really trusting. It is a very good thing that donators are trusting organizations. One highlight that I want to bring, it's about democracy issues. One of our respondents said, my money goes on a regular basis to Akcja Demokracja, an NGO who mobilize Polish civil society when our democracy is in the trouble. Yes, I think that it pays off, because supporting democracy, it's very important. And also supporting these kind of organizations is helping right voices to be heard. And we, during all these panels, discussed about how much power and money have big multinationals, and how money is actually sometimes making changes in the movements for nonprofits. Successful examples, it's quite interesting what are considered by our respondents as successful examples of social movements. Fridays for Future mentioned a lot of times. It's exactly a very successful one because it changed actually public debate. Media is talking about this now, but also American Civil Liberties Union. I think it's a big thing in the North America and the US especially, fighting against death penalty, against incarceration. It's Planned Parenthood, Amnesty International, Black Lives Matter, Greenpeace. And what is uniting all of them is that they were successful in mobilizing public opinion to put pressure on political governments. But on the other side, there is other organizations which are impacting the way how we are living every single day. And there I am classifying like the movement Me Too, 9 major groups of UN conferences, the female lead, and these kind of movements, which are actually changing the way we are interacting between each other. And very interesting thing, and we discussed, I mean, you asked this question about successful civil society, and I was surprised to read this answer, was political parties that win elections are successful civil society groups. So defining civil society is also sometimes very difficult, and we at Greycells steering committee had some time to brainstorm about it also. I will move. I have a lot of things to say, but I think I don't have that much time. There are also failed social movements. For example, someone is saying that there is no failed social movement. Anyone who is trying to organize itself around any social good goal is already a success. But there are also some concrete examples. Someone mentioned Gilets Jaunes movement because it was started, according to the respondent, as a spontaneous mobilization of socially marginalized, economically poor people, but then was infiltrated by violent extremist groups. It's not necessarily my opinion, but human rights defenders are murdered continuously. It is important and interesting angle also when we are seeing human rights defenders in Turkey, in Russia, or in other parts of the world murdered. This is not successful movement, let's say. And then we see that there were member states lobbied for the social and solidarity economy, and it didn't pass at the UN, so it was not that successful. Black protest in Poland, maybe you heard in the beginning of the protest when the Polish government was trying to pass a very hard anti-abortion law. But at the end of the day, so-called constitutional court actually pushed for that movement. So in the beginning it was successful, but then it failed. Someone was perhaps a bit ironical, saying that Trump supporters in the Capitol Hall were a successful social movement example. Well, mobilization against Iraq war. Today we talked about other mobilization that we don't know, but mobilization against Iraq war was really and unfortunately unsuccessful social movement. Now we are seeing Hong Kong event, and Arab Spring was very oftenly mentioned as an example of unsuccessful social movement. I will pass to, no, it's Lucia. Okay, so I will finish here. Thank you.
International. I'm based in Spain. And the ANOVA, we work in the social and health field in 19 countries. Continuing with the survey results, as we have heard today, like it or not, for-profit private firms play a major role in influencing governments, policies, and global agendas. And most of the respondents of the survey highlighted that these are more influential than non-profit entities. And most responses also believe that social mobilization has an impact on the accountability of the private sector, mainly at the national, local, and global level. Therefore, the thought arises on how to encompass and channel this private firm's interests with sustainable development and global goals arising from social mobilization. Indeed, it will be key to link aspects such as climate change or poverty to private companies' goals and to be able to measure the impact of those private companies at the long term. In my view, and as already mentioned by today's panelists, there are various ongoing trends and aspects that could improve the synergies by, for instance, enhancing corporate social responsibility, or even better, the OECD guidelines mentioned by Raymond Saner. Also demanding and well-informed clients that promote a system of accountability. Non-profit organizations should be also learning from private companies on their organizational, professional, and efficiency skills. And in this globalized world, it's important to promote the message of thinking globally and acting locally. Results from the survey show that most responders are positive about the increasing role of civil society in the past 25 years, because indeed NGOs have long had a merely consultative or operational role in the functioning of decision-making processes of international organizations. But today, however, many of them are now involved in defining policies and priorities for the programs of international organizations. And as a representative from the ANOVA, I can say that we are really pleased to witness on how much civil society organizations have gained space and voice at particular UN level forums especially during this last decade. And it's also important to say that this has also come hand in hand with a better organization of civil society organizations and platforms, this is key, that have adapted their work to operate at international forums by speaking like in their language and also acting as former stakeholders. To the question of who is more engaged, if millennials or seniors, there were mixed answers, but the majority believe that millennials are more engaged. And looking at which methods have more impact on policymakers, it's interesting to see that at the first place, there are elections, then the use of social media at the second place, street mobilization, and strikes continue by far. Moreover, the survey respondents did predominantly distinguish between the impact and motivation of civil society mobilizations depending of if this were happening in high income or low income countries, because the drivers of mobilizations were different. In low income countries, it's more related to and linked to poverty and the lack of economic and social opportunities. Whereas in high income countries, the social mobilizations might be more linked to global challenges. The space of civil society, it's also different according to the economic development, no surprises here, and also the level of education was highlighted by the respondents. As in high-income countries, there are more people with higher educations that are more sensitive towards social movements and that have more access to information. And this leads to my final reflection on what could be done to empower civil society mobilizations in low-income countries for accessing the networks and that whole political and financial power that enable change. So I thank you for your attention.
Yes, so for the last part of the survey, I'm Chiara Müller, and I'm Vice President of an NGO called GIMAN that promotes the international environment to students. So the questions I analyzed were about the factors that are relevant for the impact of social mobilizations. And it will be not surprising that the first one most voted was the visibility on social media. Obviously, mostly in this time of COVID, the world is around social media. The news are about social media. Everybody is on there. And the communication happens also there. And like Mr. Sana also spoke about, all the this mirroring of what is happening and what needs to be done, the knowledge that we have is on social media, so it's normal that this was the first answer. But the second one was the financial support. That is a realistic answer, we need the money. But was said a bit, what was said is that the strong civil society group support and the governmental support were answers that didn't receive as much interest as the other one. So we should think about this and show that actually this support is more important than the social media is about the people. And so the age, the political opinion, and the private forum supports didn't seem to have as much as an impact in the social mobilization as the others in this first question. The other questions were about the role of philanthropic organizations, particularly private and family foundations, in influencing local, national, or global policy making, and if it was positive, negative, or neutral. And mostly, the people answered that it was a positive, but there were too many people saying that it had a neutral or negative effect. And this is so sad, but this is the vision a lot of people have about these philanthropic organizations. We also, Greycells also asked to provide some examples of high net worth individuals or private philanthropic foundations. And there were not many answers. People knew about Bill Gates with Melinda, so the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They talked about the health, the women, the children, but they were not able to tell about many others. And tonight we met so many personalities, so many people that are making a difference. And we should let others see that. Let others see that there are so many people working for this, and there are not only so little personalities. There are so many that need the view on the social media that seems to be the most important part of all this. And to show these personalities to the public, to the people who answered this survey, and to show them in events like that. And like this here, like so many different events. And this is what I wanted to underline. And thank you, this is it.
Merci beaucoup à tous les quatre pour les résultats de cette enquête.
Thanks to the four of you for the important results about the poll. I now have the pleasure to greet three more personalities that will come one after the other. First of all, Mr. Ambassador Salman Bad, who is with us. He is the director of the CAGI, the Centre d'accueil of the Genève International. Thank you very much for being with us on stage. Good evening. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate in this important event. I have followed the discussion with great interest. Thanks to all the speakers. And as well, I will try to follow up on two elements. Social mobilization. Social mobilization, I believe, is a reality which in many sectors has had a great impact on our daily life. When I started preparing for this meeting, there were 2 or 3 events which I was reminded of. First of all, when I was a child, the movement of green parties everywhere in Europe. The forest was in great difficulty. Forest extinction was a reality. And it started with a social mobilization, and it started with the creation of green parties, which to this day in many countries are in government. So from a social movement was born a political party which in many countries is taking governmental responsibility. Another event that I was reminded of when I was in my 20s, which was the anti-mining convention, anti-personal mine convention. We have spoken to say that in the UN it is difficult to change things because there are only 93 member states. There are a few member states which are always against new initiatives, but actually this mobilization to ban anti-personal mine has shown how civil society can change things, can change laws, and it's also shown, it was also the key element of a personality, a public figure such as Princess Diana, who was a key member of the campaign. But what was interesting is that this social mobilization wasn't one in which political parties or political movements took place, but there were other initiatives who tried to copy this social mobilization. The other element that I also wanted to mention, and that several speakers have mentioned, is the vote on a CO2 law, which we had in Switzerland a couple of weeks ago. What surprised me is that when I read the analysis that existed, is that the age group 35 and younger was the group that has rejected the law the most strongly. And I was surprised because this environmental movement, this climate movement, which we've experienced for the past few years, Fridays for Future, we've had a federal election in Switzerland where green parties won massively. We've had the impression that social mobilization for this law was there. And I was surprised to see that in the anti-generational gap and the anti-age gap, it was the rural vote against the urban vote, and it was the age gap was also very relevant. And this is what I would like to conclude on. It seems that on another day, the intergenerational dialogue is something that we're able to do better and better. Yet when I see the votes, the analysis of votes in Switzerland, we see that there is a major gap between urban and rural citizens. And perhaps in order to, we should also create bridges between rural and urban, and perhaps we should inspire ourselves from these intergenerational dialogues. And I will conclude with this. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Paulade is also with us today. You are the director of the Institute for Research of the United Nations for Social Development, and I also introduced Corinne Momal-Vagnon, who is the executive director of the Kofi Annan Foundation. Paulade, you have the floor for a few concluding words.
To say is it's been a really enjoyable set of panels, and I have loved hearing the stories. And I think for me, the inescapable conclusion is that the role of individuals, of people, of communities who are fighting for economic, social, environmental justice or human rights is so incredibly important in influencing the actions of those with power in governments, in the UN or elsewhere. That's my main conclusion. And in a moment, I want to talk specifically about how that engagement of civil society, of movements, of people, helped shape the SDGs. And I've got three very, I think, shocking examples of goals that wouldn't be in the SDGs if it wasn't for the engagement of civil society. But first, I work for a research institute based in Geneva. We concentrate on social policy that's connected to economic policy and environmental justice. It's called UNRIST. It's a very interesting bit of the UN because it's in the UN. Ultimately, we're responsible to member states, to governments, but actually our DNA, our makeup, our way of operating is very much based around what Richard called the second and third bits of the UN, and in particular the third bit of the UN. All of our work is with networks of practitioners, of academics, of campaigners, people in movements all around the world, but particularly in the global south, people who are working for economic justice, social justice, gender justice, fighting climate change and promoting environmental justice. And at the moment, all of our work is concentrated on overcoming inequalities and contributing to a dialogue on the new form of social contract that we need, in particular what we see as an eco-social contract. Back to my sort of shocking headlines of goals that didn't almost make it into the SDGs. My previous job before being director of UNRWA was, I was director of the MDGs in UNDP in New York. And when those were coming to an end, we strategized about how we could, convert the progress that had been made on the MDGs, but also make them better and stop member states doing what they normally do, which is bringing everything down to the lowest common denominator when they negotiate. And it was clear that that was going to happen as they tried to replace the MDGs. So our strategy was to engage fully the third UN in contributing their ideas. We had dialogues running for 4 years all around the world on thematic issues. We had national level dialogues. We had a huge survey called My World that reached 10 million people around the world. And if those things hadn't have happened, then there are 3 goals that wouldn't have made it into the SDGs. And the first one is SDG 16 on governance, what is now called peaceful and inclusive societies. And in that survey of 10 million people, it didn't matter where you lived in the world, whether it was the UK or Kazakhstan or South Africa or Zambia, people were voting that they wanted an honest and responsive government. Now, governments don't like talking about governance because it can reflect badly on themselves, but there was no way that they could get out of including a goal broadly around governance because of civil society pressure. The second one is on inequalities. That would not have made it in there. And I say this not just out of sort of personal anecdote. I say this because of a very thorough independent evaluation we did of the process afterwards. Gender equality would have made it in, but inequalities based around wealth and income are structural and systemic. And in a way, they're anathema to our capitalist system. And there is no way that governments would have reflected that in a set of goals that they would have had to abide by. The third one, and this is the punchline, is the goal on climate change. Governments fought to keep a goal on climate change out of the SDGs until civil society and academics threw their hands up in horror and said, how can you have an educational set of goals around the SDGs on sustainable development without including climate change? And those are 3 very, very concrete ways that civil society made sure that that agenda was not ridiculous in structure and outcome. And so the UN can play a role, and we talked about the convening role earlier, but when the UN plays its role well, its convening role well, it convenes with conviction and direction. And the direction is given by our charter, it's given by all the agreements on human rights that have been brokered by member states in the UN, and it's given direction by all the agreements on the environment that have taken place in the UN as well.
Merci beaucoup, Paul. Et le mot de la fin,
And the last word now, I'm delighted to hand over to Corinne Momella-Vanyan, the Executive Director of Kofi Annan Foundation. Thank you for being here. Thank you very much, and I'm going to speak very briefly because we have the France-Switzerland match later at 9 o'clock, and I think a lot of us want to go and see that. So on a more serious note, I would like to thank Greycells because it's been a very extraordinary evening. I think all the panels were very, very interesting, including the presentation of the results of the survey at the end. I hope that we will have access to these results in a written form because I would like to take a look at them in more detail. I have a few thoughts to share with you at the end of this very, very interesting evening. I'm going to do this very quickly in English.
I think that this format of intergenerational dialogue is one that we must pursue and use more and more often. I can't tell you how many times I sat during 30 years at the United Nations in meetings where the youngest person was probably me, and even when I was in my early 50s, you know? So we really do need more youth input, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. This format of dialogue is essential, and I'm going to use a famous saying that has been attributed to Benjamin Franklin and also to Confucius by some weird, but it is probably apocryph, but this is what it is. It says, tell me and I will forget. Teach me and I may remember. Involve me and I will learn and understand. And this is really the point of involving young people in our actions and our dialogues. So thank you, Greycells, for, I mean, frankly, the first time I heard the term intergenerational dialogue was when Greycells organized their first one at the Palais des Nations a few years ago. So thank you very much. Myself, I have spent 3 hours this afternoon in another intergenerational dialogue that the Kofi Annan Foundation is organizing also with Greycells. So thank you, Greycells, for teaching me that this is a good format and this is what we need to do more. I was a bit surprised that the discussions didn't dwell at greater length on the COVID-19 crisis, which is so present in our lives and our minds. Yes, it was about the planet and it was about the climate change, but I do think that, I think it was Gabriel only who talked about the leadership shown or not shown during the COVID crisis. I think the COVID-19 pandemic is a real-time test, a real-life test of how mankind can react to crisis. And it is really interesting to analyze leadership during this crisis and what that can mean for future decisions on climate change. And frankly, I would give mankind a C- on the pandemic so far, because there have been some good things happening and some not such good things happening. But overall, society has held together, and which is amazing considering that many of our social fabric was already fragilized, made much more fragile by inequalities over the last 20 years. Yet societies have mostly held up during the crisis, which I think in itself is an achievement. We have had amazing achievements in the field of vaccines, for instance. And all the people have more or less behaved well, which is amazing when you think of all the constraints that were put on people. So I do think that there are some good things that came out, that there's enormous resilience that was shown during the crisis. And yet, I agree with Gabriel, I think that said, leadership was not, some of the leadership that came through was not very encouraging. Someone did mention the access to vaccines, and that is really very shameful what is happening with the lack of access to vaccines in the global south. So I would say that there are loads of lessons to be drawn from the COVID crisis, also in terms of social mobilization, by the way. So I am a bit worried about a number of things that were said today and that I have observed in the last few years, is the fact that, and we heard it especially in the first and third panels, about continued exclusion. And this came through also during the COVID-19 crisis. Here in Geneva, people were suddenly shocked that thousands of people were lining up to get a simple bag of groceries at the beginning of the crisis last year, if you remember. So I think this brought to light the fact that there are enormous inequalities, but continued exclusion. And I don't see, unfortunately, I don't see a real effort to bring in underrepresented groups into decision-making processes, including, I'm going to be very frank, including at the United Nations. I left the United Nations so I can be more open now, but including at the United Nations, where in particular, young voices are not heard. Very clearly, they are not heard. We have made a lot of progress in increasing representation of women at the United Nations, but even then, there are still strong undercurrents of discrimination, including against women. But it's not only the United Nations, in all big multilateral decision-making organizations. So I am worried about continued exclusion from decision-making institutions at local, national, and international levels. I am worried about, in fact, the lack of social mobilization on certain themes. I think, in fact, in climate change, there is social mobilization, and that's wonderful, and that is driven by young people. I am very surprised to see, as compared to maybe 30, 40 years ago, the lack of social mobilization with regard to some extreme violence that's being brought on certain populations, like, for instance, at the moment in Ethiopia. Nobody talks about it. Nobody talks about what's happening in Tigray. So I am worried that there is a certain apathy with, among us, in our societies, on certain themes, less on others. And of course, climate change is the prime issue that we need to work on, but it's not the only one, and everything is linked. So accepting that some groups are excluded, accepting violence against some groups is not going to help us, in fact, fight climate change. So I think that's worrying. I'm worried also, and someone mentioned it, I think it may have been Chantal, about the shrinking space for civil society in some of our countries and in some of our organizations. I have to tell you that I was fighting very hard at the Palais des Nations to preserve the right for NGOs to meet at the Palais des Nations, because there was, without the authorization of some member states. And there was a big push from many member states to reduce to make sure that NGOs could only meet with the authorization of, with the sponsorship of a member state, which would defeat the whole purpose. So this, we managed to hold off this decision for now, but there is a systematic push to reduce the space, the capacity of civil society to mobilize. So this is worrying. Nevertheless, because I'm an optimist, I want to end on a positive note. I'm very, very hopeful because of what I see in the younger generation, because of what the extraordinary things that have been achieved by the people that were here tonight, including, for instance, Andrea in Mexico, in making sure that this law passed for the protection of domestic workers, but everybody else who was here. And all the examples I heard this afternoon earlier with the Kofi Annan change makers, these young people that we are also having a dialogue with. So I'm very hopeful. I see it in my own children who are in their 20s. The values of the young generation are all right. They want the right thing. They still don't always mobilize. Many do, but they prefer to do it in the street rather than through our traditional structures of political parties, which are not civil society organizations, I have to say. So there is the right attitude, the extraordinary awareness in the young generation. However, there is this does not translate at the polls. There is great apathy towards politics, and that is a shame, because in many countries that's the way you can make things move. And I think, as was said also earlier, you need both. You need movements in the street, and you need people to vote the right way. So I think, if the young people can do this extra step, then we really will have the solutions we need. And I'm very hopeful, because they are an extraordinary generation that is really, really committed to positive change. So thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Corinne.
Thank you very much, Corinne Momal-Vagnan. Thanks to each of you. Alejandro Bonillo Garcia will join us on the stage for a few concluding words. Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank you for your attention, to thank all the people that have participated to the organization of the evening, and thank you particularly to Emily Ferreira and Sarah Mackley, who were our interpreters tonight. They've done an amazing work. Thank you very much. And thank you also to the technical team, in which we can also congratulate as well. Thank you very much. Thanks to each of you. We have had 3 extraordinary hours here. We've learned a lot. I have learned a lot. This has reminded me some of the missions I had in Dominican Republic, where there was a sign that would say there is one thing that is worse than cancer. And we would spend 3-4 kilometers later. It says worse than cancer is to have cancer and not knowing you have cancer. And now that we know we have problems, we don't have all the solutions, but at least there are people like you, captivating people who with great talent and passion, who are working to find the responses. Thank you for a memorable evening. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Momal-Vagnan. We are truly delighted to collaborate with the Kofi Annan Foundation. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador Salman Bal, for the wonderful welcome that you give every day in Kaji. Thank you very much, Mr. Director for the Research Institute of the United Nations, Mr. Paul Ladd, for your participation. And I would like to mostly thank, on top of the technical team up here, I would like to thank absolutely Jérémy Sedou, who was wonderfully moderated this debate. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, and have a great evening. Thank you.